What shall we do? His son Frederick suggested accepting the invitation. Better to watch out for a single, known enemy than many unknown ones. He's right, father, buandulino said. You stay in that castle, and my friends and I will represent a barrier around you, so that no one can approach you without passing over our bodies, day or night. We will taste first every substance presented to you. Don't say anything. I'm not a martyr. Everyone will know that we will eat and drink before you, and nobody will consider it wise to poison one of us, because then your wrath would be unleashed on every inhabitant of that castle. Your men need rest. Cilicia is inhabited by Christian peoples. The Sultan of Iconium no longer has troops to pass the mountains and attack you again. Saladin is still too far off. This region is made up of peaks and crevasses that are excellent natural defenses. It seems to be the ideal land for restoring everyone's strength. After a day's march in the direction of Seleucia, they entered a gorge that left them barely enough space to follow the course of the river. All of a sudden the gorge opened out, allowing the river to run over a vast flat stretch, before accelerating its course and descending, engulfed by another gorge. Not very far from the shore, sprouting from the plain like a mushroom, rose a tower of irregular lines, standing out, pale blue, before the eyes of those coming from the east, while the sun was setting behind it, so that, at first sight, it was impossible to tell whether the tower was the work of man or of nature. Only as you neared it could you understand that it was a sort of rocky mass on which a castle was built, from which obviously one could dominate both the plain and the girdle of surrounding mountains. There, Ardzruni said then. My lord, you may encamp your army in the plain, and I advise you to deploy it over there, below the river, where there is space for the tents and water for men and animals. My castle is not large, and I suggest you climb up to it only with a group of trusted men. Frederick instructed his son to deal with the encampment and to remain with the army. He decided to take with him only about 10 men, along with buandulino and his friends. His son tried to protest, saying he wanted to be near his father and not a mile away. Once again he looked at buandulino and his men with scant trust, but the emperor could not be swayed. I will sleep in that castle, he said. Tomorrow morning I will bathe in the river, and for that I have no need of you. I will swim to your camp to wish you good day. The son said that his will was law, but reluctantly. Frederick separated himself from the main body of the army, with his 10 armed men, buandulino, the poet, Boron, Abdul, Solomon, and Boidi, who was dragging Zosimos on his chain. All were curious to learn how they would climb up to that refuge, but, going around the massif, they discovered finally that to the west the drop was less severe, only a little, but enough to dig into it and carve a stepped path, on which no more than 2 flanked horses could pass at once. Anyone wishing to ascend with hostile intentions had to climb the broad steps slowly, so just a pair of lone archers, from the battlements of the castle, could wipe out the invaders, 2 by 2. At the end of the climb a portal opened into a courtyard. From the exterior of that gate the path continued, grazing the walls and, even narrower, the brink of the cliff, to another, smaller gate, on the north side, then it ended, over the void. They entered the courtyard, which gave access to the actual castle, its walls bristling with slits, but defended in their turn by the walls that separated the courtyard from the abyss. Frederick deployed his guards on the outer ramparts, so they could survey the path from above. It did not seem that Ardzruni had men of his own, beyond a few attendants who guarded the various doors and passages. I don't need an army here, Ardzruni said, smiling with pride. I cannot be attacked, and besides, as you, holy emperor, will see, this is not a place of war, it is the refuge where I pursue my studies of air, fire, earth, and water. Come, I will show you where you can be lodged in a worthy fashion. They climbed a great staircase, and at the second turn they entered a spacious salle d'armes, furnished with some benches and with panoplies on the walls. Ardzruni opened a solid wood door with metal studs, and led Frederick into a sumptuously furnished chamber. There was a bed, with a canopy, with cups and candelabra of gold, surmounted by an ark of somber wood, perhaps a coffer or a tabernacle, and there was a broad fireplace ready to be lighted, with logs and pieces of a substance similar to coal, but covered by some oily matter, which probably was to feed the flame, all neatly laid out on a bed of fresh boughs, and covered with sprigs of aromatic berries. It's the best room at my disposal, Ardzruni said, and for me it is an honor to offer it to you. I do not advise you to open that window. It's an eastern exposure and tomorrow morning the sun might bother you. These colored panes, a wonder of Venetian art, will delicately filter the light. No one can enter through that window? The poet asked. Ardzruni laboriously opened the window, which was, in fact, shut with various bolts. You see, he said, it's very high, and beyond the court are the ramparts, where the emperor's men are already on guard. In fact, the ramparts of the outer walls could be seen, the gallery on which, at intervals, the guards passed, and, just an arrow's shot from the window, 2 great circles or plates of shiny metal, deeply concave, set on a support between the battlements. Frederick asked what this was. They are mirrors of Archimedes, Ardzruni said, with which that sage of ancient times destroyed the Roman vessels that were besieging Syracuse. Each mirror captures and refracts the rays of light that fall parallel to its surface, and for that matter it reflects objects. But if the mirror is not flat and is curved in the proper way, as geometry, that supreme science, teaches us, the rays are not reflected parallel, but are all concentrated in a specific point in front of the mirror, according to its curve. Now, if you so orient the mirror that it captures the sun's rays at its moment of maximum radiance and bring them to strike, altogether, a single distant point, such a concentration of solar rays on that precise point creates combustion, and you can set fire to a tree, the planking of a ship, a war machine, or the dry brush around your enemies. There are two mirrors because one is curved so that it strikes at a distance, the other sets fire at a closer range. So with these two very simple machines I can defend this castle of mine better than if I had 1,000 bowmen. Frederick said that Ardzruni should teach him that secret, because then the walls of Jerusalem would fall better than those of Jericho, not through the sound of trumpets but through the rays of the sun. Ardzruni said he was there to serve the emperor. Then he closed the window and said, "Air doesn't enter here, but through other fissures. Despite the season, since the walls are thick, you might feel cold tonight. Rather than light the fire, which smokes annoyingly, I advise you to cover yourself with these furs you see on the bed. I apologize for my vulgarity, but the Lord created us with a body. Behind this little door there is a cubbyhole, with a less than royal seat, but anything your body wants to expel will fall into a cistern underground, without infecting this space. This room can be entered only by the door we have just passed through. Beyond that, once you have fastened it from inside with the latch, your courtiers will be sleeping on those benches, perhaps not comfortably, but they will guarantee your serenity." They noticed on the breast of the fireplace a circular relief. It was a Medusa head, the hair twisted like snakes, eyes closed, and an open fleshy mouth, which displayed a dark cavity whose bottom could not be seen, like the one I saw with you in the cistern, Master Nikitas. Frederick became curious and asked what it was. Ardzruni said that it was a Dionysus ear. "It is one of my magic devices. In Constantinople there are still old stones of this sort. It was enough simply to carve the mouth better. There is a room below, where as a rule my little garrison stays, but as long as you, Emperor, are here it will be left empty. Everything that is said down there comes forth from this mouth, as if the speaker were just behind the sculpture. So if I choose, I can hear what my men are talking about." "If only I could know what my cousins are talking about," Frederick said. "Ardzruni, you are invaluable. We will talk further also of this. Now let us make our plans for tomorrow. In the morning I want to bathe in the river. You can reach it easily, by horse or on foot," Ardzruni said, "and without even passing through the courtyard where you entered. In fact, beyond the door of the Salle d'Armes there is a little stairway that leads to a second court. From there you can find the main path again. Buandulino," Frederick said, "have some horses ready in that court for tomorrow morning." "Dear father," Buandulino said, "I know very well how much you like to face the most turbulent waters. But now you are tired from your journey and from all the trials you have undergone. You are unfamiliar with the waters of this river, which seems to me full of whirlpools. Why do you want to risk this?" "Because I am not so old as you think, my son, and because, if it weren't late, I would go to the river at once. I feel filthy with dust. An emperor must not stink, unless it be with the oil of holy unctions. Arrange for the horses. As Ecclesiastes tells us, Rabbi Solomon said timidly, 'Thou shalt not swim against the river's current.' And who says I will swim against it?" Frederick laughed. "I'll follow it. It is not good to wash oneself too often," Ardzruni said, "unless under the guidance of an expert physician, but here you are master. Now it is still early, for me it would be an undeserved honor to show you around my castle." He led them back down the grand staircase. On the lower floor they crossed a hall reserved for the evening banquet, already alight with many candelabra. Then they passed through a saloon full of stools, on some of which was carved a great overturned snail, a spiral structure that closed into a funnel with a central hole. "This is the guard's room I told you about," he said, "and those who speak with their mouths to this aperture can be heard in your chamber." "I would like to hear how it works," Frederick said. Buandulino, in jest, said that during the night he would come here to greet him as he was sleeping. Frederick laughed and said no, because that night he wanted to rest peacefully. "Unless," he added, "you have to warn me that the Sultan of Iconium is entering through the fireplace flue." Ardzruni led them along a corridor, and they entered a hall with vast vaults, which glowed and was smoky with swirls of steam. There were some cauldrons in which a molten matter was boiling, retorts and alembics, and other curious receptacles. Frederick asked if Ardzruni produced gold. Ardzruni smiled, saying that such were the tall tales of alchemists. But he knew how to gild metals and produce elixirs that, if they did not grant long life, at least extended the very brief life that is our lot. Frederick said he didn't want to taste them. "God has set the length of our life, and we must resign ourselves to his will. Perhaps I'll die tomorrow, perhaps I'll live to be 100. It's all in the hands of the Lord." Rabbi Solomon observed that his words were very wise, and the two conversed a while on the matter of divine decrees, and it was the first time that Buandulino heard Frederick speak of these things. While the two were talking, out of the corner of his eye Buandulino saw Zosimos, stepping through a little door into an adjoining room, with Ardzruni, looking concerned, immediately after him. Fearing that Zosimos knew some passage that would allow him to escape, Buandulino followed the two and found himself in a little room where there was only a kneading trough, and, on top of it, 7 gilded heads. All of them portrayed the same bearded countenance, and were set on pedestals. They were obviously reliquaries, because it was clear that the heads could be opened like containers, but the edges of the lids, on which the face was drawn, were fixed to the rear part by a seal of dark wax. "What are you looking for?" Ardzruni was asking Zosimos, not noticing Buandulino. Zosimos replied, I have heard that you make relics, and for them you use your diabolical skill in gilding metals. They're heads of the Baptist, aren't they? I have seen others, and now I know for sure where they come from. Buandulino delicately cleared his throat. Ardruni wheeled around and put his hands to his mouth, his eyes rolling with fear. I beseech you, Buandulino, say nothing to the Emperor or he'll have me hanged, he said in a low voice. Well, yes, these are reliquaries with the true head of St. John the Baptist. Each of them contains a skull, treated with fumigation so that it shrinks and seems very ancient. I live in this land without any resources of nature, without fields to sow, and without livestock, and my wealth is limited. I fabricate relics, true, and they are much in demand both in Asia and in Europe. I have only to sell one of these heads at a great distance from the other, for instance, one in Antioch and the other in Italy, and nobody realizes that there are two of them. He smiled with oily humility, as if asking indulgence for a sin that was, after all, venial. I never took you for a virtuous man, Ardruni, Buandulino said, laughing. Keep your heads, but let's leave here at once, else we'll arouse the suspicions of the others, including the Emperor. As they went out, Frederick was concluding his exchange of religious reflections with Solomon. The Emperor asked what other prodigious things their host had to show them, and Ardruni, anxious to get them out of that room, led them back into the corridor. From there they came to a closed double door, beside which was an altar of the kind pagans used for their sacrifices, altars of which Buandulino had seen many remains in Constantinople. On this one there were faggots and twigs. Ardruni poured over them a thick, dark liquid, took one of the torches illuminating the corridor, and set the pile afire. Immediately the altar flared up, and in the space of a few minutes they began to hear a faint subterranean churning, a slow creak, while Ardruni, with arms upraised, uttered formulas in a barbaric language, but looking now and then at his guests, as if to let them know he was imitating a hierophant or necromancer. Finally, to the amazement of all, the two leaves of the door opened without anyone's having touched them. Wonders of the hydraulic art, Ardruni smiled with pride, which I cultivate, following the learned mechanics of Alexandria, of many centuries ago. It's quite simple. Beneath the altar there is a metal vessel that contains water, which is heated by the fire on the altar. The water is transformed into steam and, through a siphon, which is merely a bent pipe that serves to decant the water from one place to another, this steam goes to fill a bucket where, as the steam cools, it is transformed back into water. The weight of the water makes the bucket fall lower. Descending, the bucket, through a little pulley from which it hangs, moves two wooden cylinders, which act directly on the hinges of the door. And the door opens. Simple, isn't it? Simple? Frederick said. Amazing. But did the Greeks really know such wonders? These and others, and they were known also to the Egyptian priests, who used this device to command, by speaking, the opening of the doors of a temple, while the faithful cried miracle, Ardruni said. Then he invited the emperor to cross the threshold. They entered a room in whose center rose another extraordinary instrument. It was a leather sphere fixed to a circular surface by what seemed to be handles bent at right angles, and the surface held a kind of metallic basin beneath which there was another pile of wood. From the sphere, above and below, ran two little pipes, which ended with two taps facing in opposite directions. On closer observation, you could see that the two handles holding the sphere to the round level were also pipes, which below were fixed to the basin, and above penetrated the interior of the sphere. The basin is filled with water. Now we'll heat this water, Ardruni said, and again he started a great fire. They had to wait a few minutes before the water came to a boil, then a hissing was heard, faint at first, then louder, and the sphere began to revolve around its supports, while from the taps came puffs of steam. The sphere turned for a little while, then its impetus seemed to weaken, and Ardruni hastened to seal the little faucets with a kind of soft clay. He said, here again the principle is simple. The water boiling in the basin is transformed into steam. The steam rises in the sphere, but, emerging violently from opposite directions, it imposes on it a rotary motion. And what miracle does it pretend to be? Buandulino asked. It doesn't pretend anything, but it demonstrates a great truth. Namely, it allows us to see the existence of the vacuum. Just imagine boron then. Hearing the vacuum mentioned, he became suspicious at once and asked how this hydraulic toy proved that the vacuum exists. It's simple, Ardruni said. The water in the basin becomes steam and fills the sphere. The steam escapes the sphere making it rotate. When the sphere looks as if it will stop, it's a sign that it has no more steam, so you close the taps. And then what remains in the basin and in the sphere? Nothing. That is to say, the vacuum. I'd really like to see it, Boron said. To see it, you'd have to open the sphere, and then air would immediately enter. However, there is a place where you can stand and sense the presence of the vacuum. But you are aware of it only briefly, because, for lack of air, you will die of suffocation. And where is this place? It's a room above us. Now I'll show you how I can create a vacuum in that room. He held up the torch and showed us another machine that till then had remained in the shadows. It was far more complex than the two previous ones, because it had, so to speak, its viscera exposed. There was an enormous alabaster cylinder, which showed in its interior the dark shadow of another cylindrical body that occupied half of it, while half protruded, its upper part bolted to a kind of enormous handle that could be operated by a man's two hands, as if it were a lever. Ardruni operated that lever, and the inner cylinder was seen to move first up, then down, until it completely occupied the exterior cylinder. To the upper part of the alabaster cylinder a great tube was attached, made of pieces of animal bladders, carefully sewn together. This tube was finally swallowed by the ceiling. On the lower part, at the base of the cylinder, a hole opened. Now then, Ardruni explained, here we have no water. Only air. When the inner cylinder is lowered, it compresses the air contained in the alabaster cylinder, expelling it through the hole at the base. When the lever raises it, the cylinder operates a lid that blocks the hole on the inside, so that air that has left the alabaster cylinder cannot re-enter. When the inner cylinder is raised completely, it operates another lid that allows air to enter through the tube you can see. It comes from the room I have told you about. When the inner cylinder is lowered again, it expels that air also. Little by little the machine draws all the air from that room and expels it here, so in that room the vacuum is created. And no air enters that room from anywhere else? Buandulino asked. No, as soon as the machine is set in motion, through the ropes to which the lever is attached, every hole or fissure that might allow air in the room is sealed. But with this machine you could kill a man if he were in that room, Frederick said. I could, but I have never done so. I did put a chicken there. After the experiment I went up to the room and the chicken was dead. Boron shook his head and murmured into Buandulino's ear, don't trust him. He's lying. If the chicken was dead, it would mean that the vacuum exists. But since it does not exist, the chicken is still alive and kicking. Or if it's dead, it died of overwork. Then he said, raising his voice, to Ardruni, have you ever heard of animals dying also at the bottom of a well, where candles go out? Some have drawn the conclusion that there is no air down there, there is no air and hence there is a vacuum. On the contrary, at the bottom of wells fine air is lacking but the thick and mephitic air remains, and it suffocates both men and a candle's flame. You breathe the fine air, but the thick remains, which doesn't allow us to inhale it, and that's enough to kill your chicken. Enough, Frederick said. All these devices are charming, but except for the mirrors up above, none could be used in a siege or in a battle. So what use are they then? Let's go, I'm hungry. Ardruni, you promised me a good supper. It seems to me the time for it has come. Ardruni bowed and led Frederick and his men into the banquet hall, which, truth to tell, seemed splendid, at least to people who for weeks had eaten the scant provender of the camp. Ardruni offered the best of Armenian and Turkish cuisine, including some very sweet cakes that gave his guests the sensation of drowning in honey. As all had agreed, Buandulino and his friends tasted every dish before it was offered to the emperor. Contrary to court protocol, but in war protocol always suffers numerous exceptions, they all sat at the same table, and Frederick drank and ate merrily, as if he were one of them, listening with curiosity to a debate that had begun between Boron and Ardruni. Boron was saying, you insist on talking about the vacuum, as if it were a space lacking any other body, even aerial. But a space lacking all bodies cannot exist, because space is a relation among bodies. Further, the vacuum cannot exist because nature holds it in horror, as all the great philosophers tell us. If you suck air through a reed immersed in water, the water rises because it cannot leave a space empty of air. Furthermore, listen. Objects fall towards the earth, and an iron statue falls more rapidly than a piece of cloth. Birds fly because by moving their wings they stir up much air, which supports them in spite of their weight. They are supported by the air just as fish are supported by the water. If the air weren't there, the birds would fall, but, mind you, at the same speed as any other body. Hence, if in the sky there were the vacuum, the stars would have an infinite velocity, because they would not be restrained in their fall, or in their circling, by the air, which resists their immense weight. Ardruni rebutted. Whoever told you that the speed of a body is in proportion to its weight? As John Philoponus said, it depends on the movement that is impressed on it. And anyway, tell me this, if there were no vacuum, how would things move? They would bump against the air, which wouldn't allow them to pass. Oh no, when a body moves, the air from the space the body then occupies shifts and fills the space that the body has left. Like two people going in opposite directions along a narrow street. They suck in their bellies, each pressing against the wall. As one gradually slips in one direction, the other slips in the opposite, and finally one man has taken the other's place. Yes, because each of the two, thanks to his own will, impresses a movement on his own body. But it isn't the same with air, which has no will. It moves because of the impetus imposed on it by the body bumping into it. But the impetus generates a movement in time. At the moment when the object moves and imposes an impetus on the air opposite it, the air has not yet moved, and therefore is not yet in the place that the object has just left to press against it. And what is in that place, if only for an instant? The vacuum. Buandulino until then had been amused, following the altercation, but now he had had his fill of it. Enough, he said. Tomorrow perhaps you can try putting another chicken in the upper room. Now, speaking of chickens, let me eat this one, and I hope it was slaughtered in the usual fashion. 25. Buandulino sees Frederick die twice. The supper went on until late, and the emperor asked to retire. Buandulino and his friends followed him to his chamber, which they inspected again with attention, by the light of 2 torches set in the walls. The poet chose also to take a look at the flue of the fireplace, but it narrowed almost immediately, allowing no room for the passage of a human being. You're lucky if the smoke can pass through here, he said. They also peered into the little defecation cubbyhole, but nobody could have climbed up from the bottom of the pit. By the bed, along with a lamp already lighted, there was a jug of water, and Bottolino insisted on tasting it. The poet remarked that they could have put a poisonous substance on the pillow where Frederick's mouth would rest while he was sleeping. It would be a good thing, he pointed out, if Frederick were to have an antidote always within reach. You never know. Frederick told them not to exaggerate their fear, but Rabbi Solomon humbly asked permission to speak. My lord, Solomon said, you know that, even though I am a Jew, I have devoted myself loyally to the mission that will crown your glory. Your life is as dear to me as my very own. Hear me, in Gallipolis I bought a wondrous antidote. Take it, he added, removing the phial from his coat, it is my gift to you, because in my poor life I will have few occasions to be deceived by powerful enemies. If by chance, one of these nights you were to feel ill, swallow this promptly. If something harmful were served you, it would save you at once. I thank you, Rabbi Solomon, Frederick said, moved, and we Teutonics were right to protect those of your race, and so we shall continue to do for the coming centuries. I swear this in the name of my people. I accept your beneficent draft, and this is what I will do with it. He drew from his traveling sack the coffer with the grazel, which now he always carried jealously with him. Here, you see, he said, I pour the liquid that you, a Jew, have given me, in the cup that contained the blood of the Lord. Solomon bowed, but murmured, perplexed, to Bottolino. The potion of a Jew becomes the blood of the false Messiah. May the Holy One, blessed be he always, forgive me. But, after all, this story of the Messiah is something you Gentiles invented, not Yoshua of Nazareth, who was a just man, and our rabbis tell us that he studied the Talmud with Rabbi Yoshua ben Parahia. And besides, I like your emperor. I believe one must obey the impulses of the heart. Frederick had picked up the grazel and was about to replace it in its ark when Kayat interrupted him. That evening all of them felt authorized to address the emperor without being asked. An atmosphere of familiarity had been established between those loyal few and their lord, pent up in a place that they could not yet deem hospitable or hostile. Kayat then said, Sire, you mustn't think I doubt Rabbi Solomon, but he too could have been deceived. Allow me to taste this liquid. Sire, I beg you, let Kayat do so, Rabbi Solomon said. Frederick nodded. Kayat raised the cup, with a celebrant's movement, then held it barely to his mouth, as if in communion. At that moment it seemed to Bottolino that an intense light spread through the room, but perhaps it was one of the torches that had flared up, at a point where the resin was thicker. For a few moments Kayat remained bowed over the cup, moving his mouth as if to absorb thoroughly the scant amount of liquid he had imbibed. Then he turned, holding the cup to his chest, and put it, delicately, in the ark. He closed that tabernacle slowly, so as not to make the slightest sound. I smell the perfume, Boron was murmuring. You see this glow? Abdul was saying. All the angels of heaven are descending around us, Zosimos said, convinced, blessing himself backwards. Son of a strumpet, the poet whispered into Bottolino's ear, with this pretext he celebrated his holy mass with the grazel, and when he goes home he'll brag from Champagne to Brittany. Bottolino whispered back, telling him not to be malicious, because Kayat had acted truly like one wrapped in the highest heavens. Now no one can deflect us, Frederick said, gripped by strong and mystical emotion. Jerusalem will soon be liberated. And then, we will all go and return this most holy relic to Prester John. Bottolino, I thank you for what you have given me. I am truly king and priest. He smiled, yet he was also trembling. That brief ceremony seemed to have overwhelmed him. I'm tired, he said. Bottolino, now I will shut myself in that room with the latch. Keep good watch, and thank you also for your devotion. Don't waken me until the sun is high in the sky. Then I will go and swim. And he repeated, I am terribly tired, I'd like not to wake again for centuries and centuries. A long peaceful night will restore you, dear father, Bottolino said affectionately. You don't have to set off at dawn. If the sun is high, the water will not be so cold. Sleep well. They went out. Frederick drew the leaves of the door closed, and they heard the click of the latch. They stretched out on the surrounding benches. We don't have an imperial cubbyhole at our disposal, Bottolino said. Let's go quickly and perform our corporal functions in the courtyard. One at a time, so we won't ever leave this room unmanned. This Ardzruni may be good, but we can trust only ourselves. After a few minutes, all of them had returned. Bottolino put out the lamp, bade all a good night, and tried to sleep. But I was uneasy, Master Nikitas, for no good reason. I fell into an anxious sleep, and I kept waking up after brief, intense dreams, as if interrupting a nightmare. In my drowsiness I saw my poor Calandrina, drinking from a grazel of black stone, then falling dead to the ground. An hour later I heard a sound. The salle d'armes also had a window, from which came a very pale nocturnal light. I believe the moon was in the fourth quarter. I realized it was the poet, who was going out. Perhaps he hadn't sufficiently emptied his body. Later, I don't know how much later, because I would fall back asleep and then wake again, and each time it seemed to me that only a few minutes had passed, but perhaps this was not true. Boron went out. Then I heard him come back, and I heard Kayat murmur to him that he too was nervous and wanted a breath of air. But after all, my duty was to keep an eye on anyone trying to enter, not on those who left, and I knew that all of us were tense. Then I don't remember, I wasn't aware of when the poet re-entered, but, long before dawn, all were deep in sleep, and so I saw them still, when, at the sun's first rays, I woke for good. The salle d'armes was now illuminated by a triumphant morning. Some servants brought wine and bread and local fruits. Though Baudolino warned them not to make a sound, so as not to disturb the emperor, all were in noisy good humor. After an hour had gone by, it seemed to Baudolino that, although Frederick had asked not to be wakened, it was late enough. He knocked at the door, without receiving a reply. He knocked again. He's sleeping heavily. The poet laughed. I hope he's not unwell, Baudolino ventured. They knocked again, louder and louder. Frederick didn't respond. Yesterday he seemed really exhausted, Baudolino said. He may have had some kind of seizure. Let's break the door open. Keep calm, everybody, the poet said. Violating the door that protects the emperor's sleep is almost a sacrilege. We'll commit the sacrilege, Baudolino said. I don't like this. In disorder, they hurled themselves against the door, which was sturdy, and the bolt barring it must have been solid. Once more, all together. When I say go, the poet said, now aware that if an emperor doesn't wake up while they're breaking down his door, his sleep is obviously suspect. The door again resisted. The poet went and liberated Zosimos, who was sleeping in his chains, and he arranged the group into 2 lines, so that together they could push forcefully against both leaves. At their 4th attempt the door gave way. Then they saw Frederick, lying in the middle of the room, lifeless, almost naked, as he had gone to bed. Beside him was the brazier, which had rolled on the ground, empty. The fireplace held only some charred remains, as if the fire had been lighted and had finally gone out. The window was shut. The room was dominated by a smell of burnt wood and charcoal. Boron, coughing, went to open the panes and allow some air to come in. Thinking that someone had entered, and was still in the room, the poet and Boron rushed, swords drawn, to examine every corner, while Baudolino, kneeling beside Frederick's body, raised his father's head and gently slapped him. Boide remembered the cordial he had bought in Gallipolis, opened the mount of his ring, forced the emperor's lips apart, and poured the liquid into his mouth. Frederick remained lifeless. His face was ashen. Rabbi Solomon bent over him, tried to open his eyes, touched his brow, his neck, his wrist, then said, trembling, this man is dead, may the Holy One, forever blessed be he, have mercy on his soul. Jesus Christ the Lord, that can't be, Baudolino shouted. Though he had no knowledge of medicine, he realized that Frederick, holy and Roman emperor, guardian of the most holy Grail, hope of Christendom, last and legitimate descendant of Caesar Augustus and Charlemagne, was no more. Immediately he wept, covered that wan face with kisses, called himself his beloved son, hoping to be heard, then realized that all was in vain. He rose, shouted to his friends to search again everywhere, even under the bed. They looked for secret passages, they sounded every wall, but it was obvious that not only was no one hiding, but no one had ever hidden in that place. Frederick Barbarossa had died in a room hermetically sealed from inside, and protected on the outside by his most devoted son. Call Ardzruni, he's an expert in the medical art, Baudolino shouted. I'm an expert in the medical art, Rabbi Solomon groaned. Believe me, your father is dead. My God, Baudolino was beside himself, my father is dead. Tell the guards, call his son. We must look for his murderers. Just a moment, the poet said. Why are you talking of murder? The room was locked. He's dead. At his feet you see the brazier, which contained the antidote. Perhaps he felt ill, feared he had been poisoned, and drank. On the other hand, there was a burning fire. Who but he could have lighted it? I know of people who feel a strong pain in the chest, become covered with cold sweat, and try to warm themselves, their teeth shattering. And they die shortly afterwards. Maybe the smoke of the fire worsened his condition. But what was in the brazier? Zosimos cried, rolling his eyes and seizing Rabbi Solomon. Stop this, you villain, Baudolino said to him. You saw yourself that Kayod tasted the liquid. Not enough, Zosimos repeated, shaking Solomon. A sip won't make you drunk. You fools, trusting a Jew. We were fools, but to trust a Greekling like you, the poet shouted, giving Zosimos a shove and separating him from the poor rabbi, whose teeth were chattering in fear. Meanwhile Kayod had picked up the brazier and religiously replaced it in its ark. So, Baudolino asked the poet, you mean to say he wasn't murdered, and he died by the Lord's will? It's easier to think that than to think of a creature made of air who passed through the door that we were guarding so well. We must call his son, and the guards, Kayod said. No, the poet said. Friends, our heads are at stake here. Frederick is dead, and we know that no one could have entered that locked room. But his son, and the others, don't know that. They'll think we're the guilty ones. What a vile idea, Baudolino said, still weeping. The poet said, Baudolino, listen. Frederick's son doesn't love you, doesn't love us, and has always distrusted us. We were on guard, the emperor is dead, and so we are responsible. Before we can say a word, the son will have us hang from some tree, and if there are no trees in this damned valley, he'll have us hang from the walls. As you know, Baudolino, the son has always considered this Grail story a plot to drag his father where he should never have gone. He'll kill us, and with one blow he's freed himself of the whole lot of us. And what about his barons? Word that the emperor has been killed will drive them to accuse one another. It will mean massacre. We are the scapegoat for the general good. Who will believe the testimony of a little bastard like you, forgive the expression, of a drunk like me, of a Jew and a schismatic, of 3 wandering clerks, and of Boydie, who, as an Alessandrian, more than anyone else had every reason to hate Frederick? We're already dead, Buandulino, just like your adopted father. And so? Buandulino asked. So, the poet said, the only solution is to make everyone believe Frederick died somewhere away from here, where it wasn't our job to protect him. How? Didn't he say he wanted to go to the river? We'll put some clothes on him and wrap him in his cloak. We'll go down to the small court, where there's nobody around, but where the horses have been waiting since yesterday evening. We'll tie him to his saddle, go to the river, and there the waters will carry him away. A glorious death for this emperor who, old as he is, confronts the forces of nature. The sun will decide whether to go on to Jerusalem or return home. And we can say that we are continuing on to the Indias, to carry out Frederick's last wish. The sun, apparently, doesn't believe in the Grazel. We'll take it, we'll go and do what the emperor would have liked to do. But we'll have to stage a mock death, Buandulino said, his eyes dazed. Is he dead? He's dead. It grieves us all, but he's dead. We're not saying he's dead when he's still alive, are we? He's dead, may God receive him among the saints. We will simply say that he drowned in the river, in the open air, and not in this room that we were to defend. Are we lying? Only a little. If he's dead, what does it matter whether he died in here or out there? Did we kill him? Everyone knows that's not so. We will have him die where even the people most hostile towards us can slander us. Buandulino, it's the only way. There's no other, if you hold your life dear and want to reach Prester John and celebrate in his presence the extreme glory of Frederick. The poet, though Buandulino cursed his coldness, was right, and they all agreed with him. They dressed Frederick, carried him to the second court, bound him to his saddle, thrusting a support behind his back, as the poet had done once with the 3 magi, so that he seemed erect on his horse. Only Buandulino and Abdul will carry him to the river, the poet said, because a large escort would attract the attention of the sentinels, who might think they should join the group. The rest of us will stay and guard the room, so Ardruni or others cannot think of entering, and we will tidy it up. Indeed, I'll go to the walls and chat with the men on guard, to distract them while the 2 of you ride out. It seemed that the poet was the only one in a condition to make sensible decisions. All obeyed. Buandulino and Abdul rode out of the court, slowly, with Frederick's horse between them. They took the side path until they reached the main one, descended the broad steps, then trotted over the plain, towards the river. From the ramparts the armigers saluted the emperor. That brief journey seemed to last an eternity, but finally they reached the shore. They hid behind a clump of trees. Here no one can see us, Buandulino said. The current is strong, and the body will be swept away immediately. We'll ride into the water to attempt rescue, but the bed is treacherous, and will not allow us to reach him. Then we will follow the body from the bank, calling for help. The current goes towards the camps. They untied Frederick's corpse, stripped it, leaving only what scant clothing the swimming emperor would have required to cover his shame. As soon as they pushed him into the middle of the river, the current seized the body, and it was pulled downstream. They entered the river, tugging on the bit so that the horses seemed to be shying in fear. They climbed out again and galloped after that poor relic, battered by water and rocks, as they waved their arms in alarm and shouted to the men in the camp to save the emperor. Farther on some men noticed their signaling, but failed to understand what was going on. Frederick's body was caught in eddies, whirling in circles. It would vanish into the water, then rise briefly to the surface. From a distance it was hard to understand that a man was drowning. In the end some did understand. 3 horsemen entered the water, but when the body reached them, it slammed against the hoofs of the frightened horses and was dragged on. Farther ahead, some soldiers went into the water with pikes, and, finally succeeding in harpooning the corpse, pulled it ashore. When Buandulino and Abdul arrived, Frederick lay there, bruised by the rocks, and no one could now imagine that he was still alive. Loud cries rose, the son was informed, and he also arrived, pale and even more feverish, lamenting that his father had wanted once again to challenge the river's waters. He raged against Buandulino and Abdul, but they reminded him that they didn't know how to swim, like almost all land creatures, and that the son knew very well, when the emperor wanted to dive into the water, no one could restrain him. To all, Frederick's body seemed bloated with water, and yet, if he had been dead for hours, he surely hadn't swallowed any. But so it goes. If you pull a dead body from the river, he looks drowned, and so you think he's drowned. While Frederick of Swabia and the other barons laid out the remains of the emperor, debating in their anguish what steps were to be taken, and while Ardruni came down into the valley, informed of the terrible event, Buandulino and Abdul returned to the castle, to make sure that by now all was in order. Imagine what had happened in the meantime, Master Nikitas, Buandulino said. It's not necessary to be a wizard. Nikitas smiled. The sacred cup, the Grazel, had disappeared. So it had. Nobody could then say whether it had disappeared while we were in the small court tying Frederick to his horse, or afterwards, when everyone was trying to tidy up the room. All were in an emotional state, buzzing around like bees. The poet had gone to distract the guards and wasn't there to coordinate, with his usual common sense, the actions of each of the others. At a certain point, when they were about to leave the room, where by now it did not seem anything dramatic had happened, Kayat glanced at the ark, and realized the Grazel was no longer there. When I arrived with Abdul, each was accusing the other, whether of theft or of negligence, saying that perhaps, while we were putting Frederick on his horse, Ardzruni had entered the room. No, no, Kayat said. I helped carry the emperor down, but I came back up at once, precisely to make sure nobody entered. In that brief time Ardzruni wouldn't have been able to come up. Then you seized him, Boran growled, grabbing him by the neck. No, if anything, you did, Kayat rebutted, pushing him away, while I was at the window throwing out the ashes collected in the fireplace. Calm down, the poet shouted. And where was Zosimos while we were down in the court? I was with you, and I came back up with you, Zosimos swore, and Rabbi Solomon confirmed this. One thing was certain. Somebody had taken the grazel, and from there it was a short step to the conclusion that the thief was the same person who had somehow killed Frederick. It was all very well for the poet to say that Frederick could have died naturally on his own, and then one of us had exploited the situation to take the grazel, but nobody believed this. My friends, Rabbi Solomon said to calm us, human folly has imagined horrific crimes, from Cain on, but no human mind has ever been so twisted as to imagine a crime in a locked room. My friends, Boran said, when we came in the grazel was here, and now it isn't. So one of us has it. Naturally, each then insisted that his bags be searched, but the poet started laughing. If someone has taken the grazel, he has put it in a secret place in this castle, where he can go and recover it afterwards. The solution? If Frederick of Swabia put up no opposition, all of us would set off together for the kingdom of Prester John, and nobody would remain behind to come and recover the grazel. I said it was a horrible thing. We would undertake a journey full of dangers, each having to rely on the support of the others, and each, -1, would suspect all the others of being Frederick's assassin. The poet said it was that or nothing, and he was right, damn him. We would have to embark on one of the greatest adventures good Christians had ever faced, and all of us would distrust all the others. And did you set out? Nikitas asked. Not right away. It would have looked like flight. The entire court met constantly to decide the fate of the expedition. The army was dissolving, many wanted to go home by sea, others wanted to sail for Antioch, still others for Tripoli. Young Frederick had chosen to proceed by land. Then the argument began over what to do with Frederick's body, some proposing to extract at once the viscera, the most corruptible part, and bury them as quickly as possible. Others wanted to await our arrival at Tarsus, the homeland of the Apostle Paul. But the rest of the body could not be preserved for long, and sooner or later it would have to be boiled in a mixture of water and wine, until all the flesh had separated from the bones, and could be buried at once, while the rest could be placed in a sepulchre in Jerusalem, once the city was reconquered. But I knew that before having the body boiled, it would have to be dismembered. I didn't want to witness that horror. I have heard that no one knows what became of those bones. I have heard the same. My poor father. On reaching Palestine young Frederick also died, consumed with grief, and with the hardships of the journey. For the rest, not even Richard the Lionheart or Philip Augustus ever arrived at Jerusalem. It was truly an unfortunate venture for all. But I learned these things only this year, after I returned to Constantinople. In those days in Cilicia I succeeded in convincing Frederick of Swabia that, to fulfill his father's wishes, we should set out for the Indias. The son seemed to me relieved by this proposal of mine. He wanted only to know how many horses I needed and what provisions. Go with God, buandulino, he said to me, I believe we will never see each other again. Perhaps he thought I would be lost in distant lands, and it was he who was lost, poor unhappy youth. He was not bad, though he was consumed by humiliation and envy. Each suspecting the others, our friends had to decide who would take part in the journey. The poet pointed out that there should be 12 in the party. If they wanted to be treated respectfully along their way to the land of Prester John, it would be advisable for people to believe they were the 12 Magi kings, on their return journey. But since it wasn't certain that the Magi really numbered 12 or 3, none of them should ever come out and say they were the Magi. On the contrary, if anyone asked, they should answer no, like someone forbidden to reveal a deep secret. Thus, denying it to all, each would believe what he chose to believe. The faith of others would make the group's reticence become truth. Now there were buandulino, the poet, Boran, Kayat, Abdul, Solomon, and Boidi. Zosimos was indispensable, because he continued to swear that he knew the map of Cosmos by heart, even though the rest of them were a bit disgusted that this crook would pass as one of the Magi, but they couldn't be too particular. 4 people were missing. At this point buandulino trusted only the Alessandrians, and had let some in on the plan. Cutica of Cornento, Calandrina's brother Calandrino Guasco, Porcelli, and Alaramo Scacciabarozzi, known as Bonehead, but a sturdy, trustworthy man, who asked few questions. They had accepted because, by now, it seemed also to them that nobody would reach Jerusalem. Young Frederick provided 12 horses and 7 mules, with food for a week. Afterwards, he said, divine providence would take care of them. While they were making their preparations for the expedition, they were approached by Ardzruni, who addressed them with the same reticent politeness he had earlier reserved for the emperor. My dear friends, he said, I know you are setting out for a distant kingdom. How do you know that, Lord Ardzruni? The poet asked suspiciously. There are rumors. I heard also some talk about a cup. Which you've never seen, have you? buandulino said to him, moving so close to him that Ardzruni had to draw back. Never seen it, but I've heard it mentioned. Since you know so many things, the poet asked, do you by any chance know if someone entered this room while the emperor was dying in the river? Did he really die in the river? Ardzruni asked. That's what his son thinks, for the present. My friends, the poet said, it's obvious that this man is threatening us. With the confusion that exists these days between the camp and the castle, it would be a simple matter to stab him in the back, and fling him somewhere or other. But first I'd like to know what he wants from us. Then perhaps I'll cut his throat afterwards. My lord and friend, Ardzruni said, I do not desire your ruin, I want to avoid my own. The emperor died in my land, after eating my food and drinking my wine. From the Imperials I can expect no favor or protection. I'll have to thank them if they leave me unharmed. Here, however, I am in danger. Once I received Frederick as my guest, Prince Leo realized that I wanted to draw the emperor to my side, against him. As long as Frederick was alive, Leo could do nothing to me, and this is an indication of how that man's death has been for me the greatest of misfortunes. Now Leo will say that, through my fault, he, Prince of the Armenians, was unable to assure the life of his most illustrious ally. An excellent opportunity to put me to death. I have no escape. I must disappear for a long time, and return with something that will restore my prestige and authority. You are leaving to discover the land of Prester John, and if you succeed it will be a glorious enterprise. I want to come with you. Doing so, above all, I will show you that I didn't take the cup you speak of, because if that were the case I would remain here and use it to negotiate with someone. I know well the lands to the east, and I could be useful to you. I know that the Duke has given you no money, and I would bring with me what little gold I possess. Finally, and Buandulino knows this, I have 7 precious relics, 7 heads of St. John the Baptist, and in the course of the journey we could sell them, one here and one there. And if we were to refuse, Buandulino said, you would go and whisper into the ear of Frederick of Swabia that we were responsible for his father's death. I didn't say that. Listen, Ardzruni, you're not a person I'd take with me anywhere, but at this point in this damned adventure each risks becoming the enemy of the other. One more enemy will make little difference. The truth is that this man would be a burden for us, the poet said. There are already 12 of us, and a 13th brings bad luck. While they were arguing, Buandulino was thinking about the heads of the Baptist. He wasn't convinced that those heads could really be taken seriously, but if they could, undeniably they were worth a fortune. He had gone down into the room where he had seen them, and had picked them up one by one to examine them carefully. They were well made, the carved face of the saint, his great eyes wide and without pupils, inspired holy thoughts. To be sure, seeing all 7 of them in a row emphasized their falsity, but displayed one by one, they would be convincing. He had replaced the heads on the kneading trough, and gone back upstairs. 3 of the group agreed to taking Ardzruni along, the others were hesitating. Boron said that, after all, Ardzruni did have the appearance of a man of rank, and Zosimos, partly for reasons of respect for those 12 venerable persons, said he could be passed off as a squire. The poet objected that the Magi either had 12 servants or else they traveled on their own in great secrecy. A single squire would create a bad impression. As for the heads, the party could take them without having to take Ardzruni. By now Ardzruni was weeping and saying that truly they wanted him dead. In the end they postponed any decision to the next day. It was, in fact, the next day, when the sun was already high in the sky, as they had almost completed their preparations, that suddenly someone realized that, for all that morning, Zosimos had not been seen. In the frenzy of the final 2 days, nobody had kept watch over him. He had also helped prepare the horses and load the mules, and had not been kept on his chain. Kayat noticed that one of the mules was missing, and Buandulino had a sudden inspiration. The heads, he cried. The heads. Zosimos is the only one, besides me and Ardzruni, who knows where they are. He dragged everyone into the little room with the heads, and there they saw that the heads now numbered only 6. Ardzruni dug under the trough, to see if by chance one head had fallen, and he discovered 3 things. A human skull, small and blackened, a seal with a C, and some burned residue of sealing wax. All was now, alas, clear. Zosimos, in the confusion of the fatal morning, had taken the grazel from the ark where Kayat had replaced it, and in a flash had gone down to the little room, opened a head, taken out the skull, and hidden the grazel in its place. With his seal from Gallipolis he had closed the lid, put the head back where it had been before, and gone upstairs innocent as an angel, to await the opportune moment. When he realized that the travelers would share out the heads, he knew he could wait no longer. It must be said, Master Nikitas, that in spite of my rage at being tricked, I felt a certain relief, and I believe that all the others felt the same. We had found the guilty party, a rascal of most credible rascality, and we were no longer tempted to suspect one another. Zosimos's villainy made us livid with anger, but it restored our reciprocal trust. There was no evidence that Zosimos, having stolen the grazel, had had anything to do with Frederick's death, because that night he had been tied to his own bed, but this brought us back to the poet's hypothesis. Frederick hadn't been murdered. They gathered and held council. First of all, Zosimos, if he had fled at nightfall, by now had a 12-hour lead on them. Porcelli pointed out that they were on horseback and he on a mule, but Buandulino reminded them that there were mountains all around them, stretching God knew how far, and on mountain trails horses move more slowly than mules. It was impossible to pursue him at top speed. He had given himself a half-day's start, and that would remain. The only thing was to find out where he was heading and then take the same direction. The poet said, first of all, he can't have set out for Constantinople. There, with Isaac Angelus on the throne, the air isn't safe for him. Further, he would have to cross the lands of the Seljuks, which we have just left after so many hardships, and he knows that sooner or later they would have his hide. The most sensible hypothesis, since he's the one who knows the map, is that he wants to do what we wanted to do. Reach the priest's kingdom, proclaim himself the envoy of Frederick, or whoever, return the Grazel, and be covered with honors. So to find Zosimos we have to journey towards the kingdom of the priest, and overtake him along the way. We'll set out, we'll ask questions as we proceed, we'll look for the trail of a Greekling monk, since you can tell his race a mile off, then you will allow me finally the satisfaction of strangling him, and we'll recover the Grazel. Very good, Boron said, but what direction do we take, since he's the only one who knows the map? Friends, Buandulino said, here Ardzruni should prove useful. He knows the places and, further, there are now only 11 of us, and we need at all costs a 12th king. And so, to his great relief, Ardzruni was solemnly allowed to become a part of that group of fearless men. As to the right road, he made sensible proposals. If the kingdom of the priest lay to the east, near the earthly paradise, then we should head for the place where the sun rises. But in proceeding so directly, we risked having to cross lands of infidels, whereas he knew the way to advance, at least for a while, through territories inhabited by Christian peoples, also because we had to remember the Baptist heads, which couldn't be sold to Turks. He assured us that Zosimos would have reasoned in the same way, and he mentioned lands and cities our friends had never heard of. With his mechanic's skill, he had constructed a kind of puppet that, in the end, resembled Zosimos, with a long, wispy beard, hair made from charred millet, and 2 black stones to serve as eyes. The portrait seemed possessed, like the man it portrayed. We will have to cross lands where they speak unknown languages, Ardzruni said, and to ask if they have seen Zosimos we can only show this image. Buandulino guaranteed that the unknown languages would create no problems, because when he had spoken with barbarians for a little while, he learned to speak as they did. But the portrait would still come in handy, because in some places there wouldn't be time to stop and learn the language. Before departing, they all went downstairs and each took one of the Baptists' heads. They were 12, and the heads now were 6. Buandulino decided that Ardzruni should refrain. Solomon surely wouldn't want to travel with a Christian relic. Cutica, Bonehead, Porcelli, and Calandrino were latecomers. So the heads would go to himself, the poet, Abdul, Kayat, Boron, and Boidi. The poet was about to grab the first immediately, and Buandulino pointed out, laughing, that they were all the same, since the only good one had been chosen by Zosimos. The poet blushed and let Abdul choose, with a broad and polite wave of his hand. Buandulino was satisfied with the last one, and each of them put his in his knapsack. That's the whole story, Buandulino said to Nikitas. Towards the end of the month of June in the year of our Lord 1190, we set out, 12 of us, like the Magi, even if less virtuous than they, to reach finally the land of Prester John. 26. Buandulino and the Journey of the Magi. From that moment on, Buandulino narrated his story to Nikitas almost continuously, not only during their stops at night, but also in the daytime. As the women complained of the heat, the children had to stop to make water, the mules every now and then refused to go on. So it was a story broken up, as their journey was, where Nikitas guessed at the gaps, the unfinished spaces, and the very long duration. And it was comprehensible because, as Buandulino continued narrating, the journey of the 12 lasted almost 4 years, between moments of bewilderment, bored delays, and painful vicissitudes. Perhaps, traveling like that under blazing suns, eyes sometimes assailed by sandy gusts, listening to new tongues, the travelers spent moments in which they lived as if burned by fever, others of somnolent waiting. Countless days were devoted to survival, pursuing animals inclined to flight, bargaining with savage tribes for a loaf of bread or a piece of lamb, digging, exhausted, for springs in lands where it rained once a year. Besides, Nikitas told himself, traveling under a sun beating down on your head, through deserts, as travelers tell, you are deceived by mirages, you hear voices echoing at night among the dunes, and when you find some bush you risk tasting berries that, rather than nourishing the belly, prompt visions. This was not to say, as Nikitas knew very well, that Buandulino wasn't sincere by nature, and if it's difficult to believe a liar when he tells you, for instance, that he has been to Iconium, how and when can you believe him when he tells you he has seen creatures that the most lively imagination would be hard-pressed to conceive, and he himself is not sure of having seen? Nikitas had determined to believe in a single thing, because the passion with which Buandulino spoke of it bore witness to its truth. That, on their journey our 12 magi were drawn by the desire to reach a goal, which became increasingly personal for each of them. Boron and Kayat wanted only to recover the Grazel, even if it hadn't ended up in the priest's kingdom. Buandulino wanted the kingdom with increasingly irrepressible passion, and with him, also Solomon, because there you would find his lost tribes. The poet, Grazel or not, sought any kingdom. Ardzruni was interested only in escaping the place where he had come from. And Abdul, as we know, thought that, the farther he went, the closer he was coming to the object of his chaste desires. The Alessandrians were the only ones who seemed to advance with their feet solidly on the ground. They had made a pact with Buandulino and they followed him out of solidarity, or perhaps greed, because if a Prester John has to be found then he has to be found. Otherwise, as Elaramo Scacciabarozzi, also known as Bonehead, insisted, people wouldn't take you seriously anymore. But perhaps they went on also because Boydie had got it into his head that, reaching the goal, they would stock up on wondrous relics, and not fakes like the Baptists' heads, and take them back to their native Alessandria, transforming that city, still without history, into the most celebrated shrine in Christendom. Ardzruni, to evade the Turks of Iconium, had immediately led them over certain passes where the horses risked breaking a leg. Then for 6 days he guided them along a stony waste sown with corpses of huge lizards a palm long, dead from sunstroke. "Thank God, we have provisions with us and don't have to eat those disgusting animals," Boydie said, with great relief, but he was mistaken, because a year later they would catch lizards even more repellent and, skewering them on twigs, they would roast them, as their mouths watered, waiting for them to be done. Then they passed through some villages, and in each they displayed the effigy of Zosimos. "Yes," one man said, "a monk just like that came this way, stayed for a month, then ran off because he'd got my daughter pregnant." "But how could he have stayed a month when we'd been traveling only 2 weeks? When did it happen?" Maybe 7 Easters ago. You see that boy, the one with scrofula over there, he's the fruit of the sin." "Then that wasn't the man. All these pigs, these monks, look the same." Or else they said, "Yes, he looks right, with a beard just like this, maybe 3 days ago, a likable little hunchback." "But if he was a hunchback, then it isn't our man." "Buandulino, could it be that you don't understand the language and are just translating what comes into your head?" Or they said, Yes, we've seen him, it was him," and they would point to Rabbi Solomon, perhaps because of the black beard. What was this? Were they maybe questioning the village idiots? Farther on, they encountered some people who lived in circular tents, who greeted them, crying, "La elik Allah Sila, Mashimed Roraz Allah." They replied with equal politeness in Alaman, since one language was worth as much as another. When they displayed the Zosimos puppet, the people burst out laughing, all talking at once, but from their gestures it could be deduced that they did recall Zosimos. He had passed through here, had offered the head of a Christian saint, and they had threatened to stick something up his behind. When our friends realized they had happened on a band of Turkish impalers, they went off with great gestures of farewell and smiles, baring all their teeth, while the poet dragged Ardzruni by the hair, pulled his head back, saying, good for you, who know the road. You were leading us right into the jaws of the Antichrists." And Ardzruni gasped that he hadn't got the road wrong. These men were nomads, and you never know where nomads are. But farther ahead, he assured them, we'll find only Christians, though they may be Nestorians. "Good," Buandulino said, "if they're Nestorians, they're at least of the priest's race, but from now on, before we say anything, we must take care, when we enter a village, to see if there are crosses and spires." Spires, indeed. What they found were clumps of mud huts, and even if they included a church, you couldn't recognize it. These were people who were content with very little in order to praise the Lord. "But are you sure Zosimos went this way?" Buandulino asked, and Ardzruni told him to rest assured. One evening Buandulino saw him as he was observing the setting sun, and he seemed to be taking measurements in the sky with his arms outstretched and the fingers of his 2 hands entwined, as if to form some little triangular windows through which he peered at the clouds. Buandulino asked him why, and he said he was trying to discern the location of the big mountain beneath which the sun vanished every evening, under the great arch of the tabernacle. "Madonna Santissima," Buandulino shouted, "don't tell me you also believe in the story of the tabernacle like Zosimos and Cosmas Indicaplustes?" "Of course, I do," Ardzruni said, as if they were asking him if water was wet. "Otherwise how could I be so sure that we're following the same road Zosimos must have taken?" "Then you know the map of Cosmas that Zosimos kept promising us?" "I don't know what Zosimos promised you, but I have the map of Cosmas." He drew a parchment from his sack and showed it to the friends. "There, you see? This is the frame of the ocean. Beyond, there are lands where Noah lived before the flood. Towards the eastern extreme of those lands, separated by the ocean from regions inhabited by monstrous beings, and these are the lands through which we will have to pass, there is the earthly paradise. It's easy to see how, setting out from this blessed land, the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Ganges pass beneath the ocean to cross the regions towards which we are traveling, and then they empty into the Persian Gulf, whereas the Nile follows a more tortuous path through the antediluvian lands, enters the ocean, resumes its course in the lower southern regions, and more precisely in the land of Egypt, emptying first into the Romaic Gulf, which the Latins call the Mediterranean, and thence into the Hellespont. Here, we must follow the route to the east, to encounter first the Euphrates, then the Tigris, then the Ganges, and turn towards the lower eastern regions." "But," the poet interjected, "if the kingdom of Prester John is very close to the earthly paradise, must we cross the ocean to reach it?" "It's close to the earthly paradise, but this side of the ocean," Ardzruni said. "But we will have to cross the Sambadion." "The Sambadion, the river of stone," Solomon said, clasping his hands. So Eldad did not lie, and this is the road towards finding the lost tribes. "We mentioned the Sambadion also in the priest's letter," Buandulino said sharply, "and so obviously it must exist somewhere." "Very well, the Lord has come to our aid. He has caused us to lose Zosimos, but he has allowed us to find Ardzruni, who apparently knows more." One day they saw, at a distance, a sumptuous temple, with columns and a decorated tympanum. But, nearing it, they saw that the temple was only a facade, the rest was a cliff, and, in fact, that entrance was up high, set into the mountain, and it was necessary to climb, God knows how, up to where the birds fly, in order to reach it. On more careful study, they saw that, along the circle of surrounding mountains, other facades stood out on high against steep walls of lava, and at times they had to narrow their eyes to distinguish the carved stone from the stone shaped by nature, and they could also make out sculpted capitals, fornices and arches, and superb colonnades. The inhabitants, down below, spoke a language very similar to Greek, and said that their city was named Bacanor, but what they saw were churches of 1,000 years past, when the place was under the dominion of Alexandros, a great king of the Greeks, who honored a prophet who had died on a cross. By now they had forgotten how to climb to the temple, nor did they know what was still inside it, and they preferred to honor the gods. They actually said gods and not the Lord God, in the open, in an enclosed space, in the center of which stood the gilded head of a buffalo on a wooden stake. That very day the entire city was celebrating the funeral of the young man whom all had loved. On the flat area at the foot of the mountain a banquet had been laid out, and in the center of the circle of tables already laden there was an altar with the body of the deceased on it. Up above, in broad curves, lower and lower, flew eagles, kites, ravens, and other birds of prey, as if they had been bidden to this feast. All dressed in white, the father approached the corpse, cut off its head with an axe, and placed it on a golden plate. Then some smiths, also dressed in white, cut the body into little pieces, and the guests were invited each to take one of those pieces and throw it to a bird, which caught it in midair, then vanished into the distance. Someone explained to Buandulino that the birds carried the dead man into paradise, and for them their right was far superior to those of other peoples, who allowed the body of the dead to rot in the earth. Then all sat down at the tables and each tasted the flesh of the head until, with only the skull remaining, clean and shiny as if it were metal, they made it into a cup from which all drank in joy, praising the departed. Another time, they were crossing, for a week, an ocean of sand, which rose like the great waves of the sea, and it seemed that everything moved beneath their feet and beneath the horses' hoofs. Solomon, who had already suffered seasickness after embarking at Gallipoli, spent those days in continuous bouts of vomiting, but he could vomit very little because the party had been able to swallow very little, and it was lucky they had provided themselves with an ample supply of water before facing this predicament. Abdul began then to suffer fever and chills, which continued to torment him for the rest of the journey, preventing him from singing his songs, as the friends invited him to do when they stopped in the moonlight. Sometimes they proceeded rapidly, over grassy meadows, and, not having to combat hostile elements, Boron and Ardzruni conducted endless debates on the question that obsessed them, namely, the vacuum. Boron employed his familiar arguments, that if there were a vacuum in the universe, nothing would prevent the existence, beyond our worlds, in the vacuum, of other worlds, etc., etc. But Ardzruni pointed out that he was confusing the universal vacuum, which could be debated, with the vacuum created in the interstices between one corpuscle and another. And when Boron asked him what these corpuscles were, his opponent reminded him that, according to certain ancient Greek philosophers, and otherwise Arab theologians, the followers of Kalam, namely, the Motokalaman, one should not think that bodies are solid substances. The whole universe, everything that is in it, and we ourselves are composed of indivisible corpuscles, which are called atoms, whose incessant movement is the origin of life. The movement of these corpuscles is the very condition of all generation and corruption. And between one atom and another, precisely in order for them to be able to move freely, is the vacuum. Without the vacuum between the corpuscles that compose every body, nothing could be cut, broken, or shattered, nor could it absorb water, or be invaded by heat or cold. How does nourishment spread in our body, if not by traveling through the empty spaces between the corpuscles that compose us? Stick a needle, Ardzruni said, into a swollen bladder, before it begins to deflate only because the needle, moving, widens the hole it has made. How is it that for an instant the needle remains in the bladder that is still full of air? Because it is insinuated into the interstitial vacuum between the corpuscles of air. Your corpuscles are a heresy, and nobody has ever seen them except your Arabs, those Kalamodum, or whatever you call them, Boron replied. While the needle is entering, a bit of air is already escaping, leaving space for the needle. Then take an empty flask, immerse it in water with the neck down. The water won't enter, because there's air. Suck the air from the flask, close it with one finger so more air won't enter, immerse it in the water, remove your finger, and water will enter where you have created the vacuum. Water rises because nature acts in such a way that the vacuum is not created. The vacuum is against nature, and being against nature it cannot exist in nature. But while the water rises, and it doesn't rise abruptly, what is there in the part of the flask that is not yet filled, since you have removed the air? When you suck out the air you eliminate only the cold air, which moves slowly, but you leave an amount of hot air, which moves rapidly. The water enters and immediately causes the hot air to escape. Now you again pick up that flask full of air, but heated, so that inside there is only hot air. Then you immerse it, neck down. Although it contains only hot air, water still won't enter. So the heat of the air is irrelevant. Oh, is it? Take the flask again, and on the bottom, towards the belly of the flask, make a little hole. Immerse it in the water, hole first. The water won't enter because there is air inside. Then put your lips to the neck, which has remained out of the water, and suck out all the air. Gradually, as you suck out the air, the water rises through the lower hole. Then pull the flask out of the water, keeping the upper hole closed, so the air won't press to enter. So you see that the water remains in the flask and doesn't escape by the lower hole, thanks to the disgust that nature would feel if it left a vacuum. The water doesn't descend the second time because it rose the first, and a body cannot make a movement opposed to the first if it doesn't receive a new stimulus. Now listen to this. Stick a needle into a swollen bladder, allow all the air to escape, WFFFF, immediately close the hole made by the needle. Then, put your fingers on both sides of the bladder, as you might pull the skin here on your hand. And you see that the bladder opens. What is there in that bladder whose walls you have widened? The vacuum. Who told you the walls of the bladder will part? Try it. No, not I am not a mechanic, I'm a philosopher, and I reach my conclusions on the basis of thought. Anyway, if the bladder opens, it's because it has pores, and after it is deflated, a bit of air has entered through the pores. Oh, really? First of all, what are pores if not empty spaces? And how can the air enter on its own if you have not imposed a movement on it? And why? Once you have taken the air from the bladder, doesn't it swell up again spontaneously? If there are pores, then, when the bladder is swollen and well closed and you press it, imposing a movement on the air, why doesn't the bladder deflate? Because the pores are, true enough, empty spaces, but smaller than the corpuscles of air. Keep pressing harder and harder, and you'll see. Then leave the swollen bladder for a few hours in the sun, and you'll see that, little by little, it deflates on its own, because the heat transforms the cold air into hot air, which escapes more rapidly. Then take a flask, with a hole on the bottom or without. Immerse it completely, tilted, into the water. You will see that, as the water gradually enters, the air emerges and goes plop plop, thus manifesting its presence. Now pull out the flask, empty it, suck out all the air, close its mouth with your thumb, put it tilted into the water, remove your thumb. The water enters but without your hearing or seeing any plop plop. Because inside there was the vacuum. At this point the poet yet again interrupted them to remind them that Ardruni should not be distracted, because with all that plop plop in those flasks everybody was growing thirsty. Their bladders were now empty, and it would be wise to head for a river or some other place more damp than where they were. Every now and then they heard something of Zosimos. This man had seen him, another had heard of a man with a black beard who was asking about the kingdom of Prester John. At which our friends would ask eagerly, and what did you tell him? The answer was almost always that they had told him what everyone in those lands knew, that Prester John was to the east, but it took years to arrive there. Foaming with anger, the poet said that in the manuscripts of the Saint Victoire library you could read that those who had traveled in those places did nothing but come upon splendid cities, with temples whose roofs were covered with emeralds, and palaces with golden ceilings, columns with ebony capitals, statues that seemed alive, golden altars with 70 steps, walls of pure sapphire, stones so luminous that they cast more light than torches, mountains of crystal, rivers of diamonds, gardens with trees emanating scented bombs that permit the inhabitants to live by simply breathing in their odor, monasteries where only highly colored peacocks are bred, whose flesh does not undergo corruption, and, taken on a journey, that flesh lasts for 30 days or more. Foaming with anger, the poet said that in the manuscripts of the Saint Victoire library you could read that those who had traveled in those places did nothing but come upon splendid cities, with temples whose roofs were covered with emeralds, and palaces with golden ceilings, columns with ebony capitals, statues that seemed alive, golden altars with 70 steps, walls of pure sapphire, stones so luminous that they cast more light than torches, mountains of crystal, rivers of diamonds, gardens with trees emanating scented bombs that permit the inhabitants to live by simply breathing in their odor, monasteries where only highly colored peacocks are bred, whose flesh does not undergo corruption, and, taken on a journey, that flesh lasts for 30 days or more even under a blazing sun, never causing a bad smell, and then glittering fountains whose water shines like the light of a thunderbolt and, if you put in it a salted fish, the fish would return to life and dart off, a sign that this is the fountain of eternal youth. Recovered with emeralds, and palaces with golden ceilings, columns with ebony capitals, statues that seem alive, golden altars with 70 steps, walls of pure sapphire, stones so luminous that they cast more light than torches, mountains of crystal, rivers of diamonds, gardens with trees emanating scented bombs that permit the inhabitants to live by simply breathing in their odor, monasteries where only highly colored peacocks are bred, whose flesh does not undergo corruption, and, taken on a journey, that flesh lasts for 30 days or more even under a blazing sun, never causing a bad smell, and then glittering fountains whose water shines like the light of a thunderbolt and, if you put in it a salted fish, the fish would return to life and dart off, a sign that this is the fountain of eternal youth. But they so far had seen desert, scrub, massifs where you couldn't even rest on the stones because they would cook your buttocks. The only cities they had encountered were made of wretched hovels inhabited by repugnant rabble, like Colindiafondas, where they had seen the Artabans, men who walked prone like sheep, or like Iambit, where they had hoped to rest after having crossed seared plains, and the women, if not beautiful, weren't too ugly, but they discovered that, faithful to their husbands, they kept poisonous snakes in their vagina to defend their chastity, and if they had at least mentioned it beforehand, but no. One woman pretended to give herself to the poet, who came close to having to accept perpetual chastity, and he was lucky because he heard the hiss and sprang back. Near the Catarides swamps they encountered men with testicles down to their knees, and at Necuviran, people naked as wild animals, who mated in the street like dogs, the father coupled with the daughter and the son with the mother. At Tana they met anthropophagi, who fortunately would not eat foreigners, whom they found revolting, but only their own children. By the river Arlan they came upon a village where the inhabitants danced around an idol and with sharpened knives inflicted wounds on themselves, in every limb. Then the idol was placed on a wagon and borne through the streets, and many of the people joyfully flung themselves under the wagon's wheels, breaking their bones to the point of death. At Salabit they crossed a wood infested with fleas as big as frogs. At Carriamaria they met hairy men who barked, and not even Buandulino could understand their language, and women with boar's teeth, hair to their feet, and a cow's tail. These and other most horrendous things had they seen, but the wonders of the East never, as if all those who had written about them were great bastards. Ardzruni urged patience, because he had also said that before the earthly paradise there was a very savage land, but the poet replied that the savage land was inhabited by ferocious animals, which luckily they hadn't yet seen, and therefore it was still to come, and if the lands they had in fact seen were the not savage ones, they could imagine the rest. Abdul, more and more feverish, said that it was impossible that his princess would live in such god-forsaken places, and perhaps they had taken the wrong road. But I certainly don't have the strength to turn back, my friends, he said faintly, and therefore I believe I will die on the road to happiness. Oh, be quiet, you don't even know what you're saying, the poet shouted at him. You made us waste 1,000 nights listening to you sing the beauty of your impossible love, and now that you see it really couldn't be more impossible, you should be happy, in seventh heaven. Buandulino pulled at his sleeve and whispered to him that Abdul was delirious by now and it was wrong to make him suffer even more. After a time that seemed endless, they came to Salapatana, a fairly wretched city, where they were received with amazement, the people moving their fingers as if to count the arrivals. Clearly, the fact that they were 12 made an impression. Everyone knelt down, except for one man, who ran off to spread the word among the other inhabitants. A sort of archimandrite came towards them, chanting in Greek and bearing a wooden cross, a far cry from silver crosses encrusted with rubies. The poet grumbled. He told Buandulino that here they had long awaited the return of the most holy Magi, who for thousands of years had experienced 1,000 adventures, after they worshipped the child in Bethlehem. And this archimandrite was in fact asking if they were returning to the land of Prester John, from whence they surely came, to relieve him of his long labor and resume the power they had once had over those blessed lands. Buandulino was exultant. They asked many questions about what lay in store for them, but they realized that these people also did not know where the priest's kingdom was, except that they firmly believed that it lay somewhere towards the east. Indeed, since the Magi actually came from down there, the local people were amazed that they themselves did not have accurate information. Most holy masters, the good archimandrite said, you are surely not like that Byzantine monk who passed through here some time ago, seeking to return to the priest some relic or other that had been stolen from him. That man had a suspect look, and was undoubtedly a heretic, like all the Greeks of the lands along the sea, because he constantly invoked the most holy Virgin Mother of God, and Nestorius, our Father and Light of Truth, has taught us that Mary was the mother only of Christ the man. How would it be possible to think of a God in swaddling clothes, a God 2 months old, a God on the cross? Only pagans give a mother to their gods. That monk is truly suspect, the poet blurted, and I must tell you that he stole that relic from us. May the Lord punish him. We allowed him to go on his way, not telling him anything of the dangers he would come upon, and therefore he knew nothing of the Abkhazia. May God punish him and plunge him into that darkness. And he will surely come upon the Manticore and the black rocks of the Buandulino. My friends, the poet murmured, these people could tell us many valuable things, but they would tell us only because we are the Magi. However, since we are the Magi, they don't think it's necessary to tell us anything. If you'll heed my advice, we'll leave here at once, because if we talk with them a little longer we'll end up making some slip and they'll understand that we don't know what the Magi should know. Nor can we offer them a Baptist's head, because I just can't see the Magi practicing simony. Let's clear out fast, because for all that they may be good Christians, nobody can assure us they're tender with anyone who tries to outsmart them. Whereupon the friends took their leave, receiving many provisions as gifts, and wondering about that Abkhazia whose darkness can so easily engulf you. They soon learned what the black rocks of the Buandulino were. They lay for miles and miles on the bed of that river, and some nomads they met shortly before had explained that whoever touched the rocks became as black as they were. Ardzruni said, on the contrary, that they must be very precious stones, which the nomads sold at God knows what distant market, and they told this fairy tale to prevent others from collecting them. He had rushed to garner a good supply, and showed the friends how shiny they were and how perfectly shaped by the water. But, as he was speaking, his face, his neck, his hands quickly became as black as ebony. He opened his shirt and his chest was now totally black. He bared his legs and feet, and they also seemed made of coal. Ardzruni flung himself naked into the river, rolled around in the water, scraped his skin with gravel from the riverbed. Nothing could be done. Ardzruni had become black as night, and you could see only the whites of his eyes and his red lips beneath his beard, also black. At first, the others laughed themselves sick, while Ardzruni cursed their mothers. Then they tried to console him. We want to be taken for the Magi, don't we? Buandulino said, well, at least one of them was black. I swear that one of the 3 lying in Cologne is black. And now our group becomes even more credible. Solomon, more considerate, remembered having heard of stones that change the color of the skin, but there are remedies, and Ardzruni would be even whiter than before. Yes, in a week of Fridays, Bonehead sniggered, and the hapless Armenian had to be restrained, because he wanted to tear the man's ear off with one bite. One fine day they entered a forest thick with leafy trees, bearing fruit of every description, through which a river ran, its water white as milk. In the forest were green clearings, with palms and vines laden with splendid bunches of grapes the size of citrons. In one of these clearings there was a village of simple, sturdy huts, of clean straw, from which men emerged naked from head to foot, and some of the males chanced to have long and flowing beards that covered their pudenda. The women felt no shame in displaying their breasts and womb, but they gave the impression of doing so in a very chaste way. They looked the newcomers boldly in the eyes, but without prompting unsuitable thoughts. These people spoke Greek and, politely welcoming the guests, they said they were gymnosophists, that is to say, creatures who, in innocent nudity, cultivated learning and practiced benevolence. Our travelers were invited to move freely in their sylvan village, and at evening they were bidden to a supper consisting only of foods produced spontaneously by the earth. Buandulino asked some questions of the oldest of their number, whom all treated with special reverence. He asked what they possessed, and the man replied, "We possess the earth, the trees, the sun, the moon, and the stars. When we are hungry we eat the fruits of the trees, which they produce by themselves, following the sun and the moon. When we are thirsty we go to the river and drink. We have one woman each and, following the lunar cycle, each man fertilizes his companion until she has produced 2 sons, then we give one to the father and one to the mother." Buandulino was surprised not to have seen a temple or a cemetery, and the old man said, "This place where we are is also our grave, and here we die, lying down in the sleep of death. The earth begets us, the earth nourishes us, beneath the earth we sleep the eternal sleep. As for the temple, we know that temples are erected in other places, to honor what they call the creator of all things. But we believe that things are born through charis, thanks only to themselves, just as they maintain themselves on their own, and the butterfly pollinates the flower that, growing, then nourishes it. But, if I understand correctly, you practice love and reciprocal respect, you do not kill animals, and, still less, your similars. By what commandment do you act? We do this to make up for the absence of any commandment. Only by practicing and teaching good can we console our similars for the lack of a father. No one can do without a father," the poet murmured to Buandulino. "Look at the state to which our beautiful army has been reduced by the death of Frederick. These people wave their cocks in the air, but they don't really know how life works." Boron, on the contrary, was impressed by this wisdom, and he began asking the old man a series of questions. "Which number is greater, that of the living or of the dead? The dead are greater, but they can no longer be counted. So those you can see are more than those you cannot see. Which is stronger, death or life? Life, because when it rises, the sun has luminous and splendid rays, and when it sets, it seems weaker. Which is more, earth or sea? Earth, because the sea rests on the bed of earth. Which came first, night or day? Night. Everything that is born is formed in the darkness of the womb and is only later brought into the light. Which is the better side, left or right? Right. Indeed, the sun rises on the right and follows its orbit in the heavens to the left, and a woman suckles her babe first with the right breast. Which is the most fierce of animals? The poet asked then. Man. Why? Ask yourself. You, too, are a wild beast. You have with you other beasts, and in your lust for power you want to deprive all other beasts of life. Then the poet said, "But if all were like you, the sea would never be sailed, the earth would never be tilled, the great kingdoms would not be born to carry order and greatness into the base disorder of earthly things." The old man replied, "Each of these things is surely fortunate, but it is built on the misfortune of others, and that we do not desire." Abdul asked if they knew where the most beautiful and most distant of all princesses lived. "Are you seeking her?" the old man asked, and Abdul answered yes. "Have you ever seen her?" Abdul answered no. "Do you want her?" Abdul answered that he did not know. Then the old man entered his hut and came out with a metal dish, so polished and gleaming that it mirrored everything surrounding it like a surface of clean water. He said, "We received this mirror once as a gift, and we could not refuse it out of courtesy towards the giver. But none of us would want to look into it, because that could lead to vanity of our body, or to horror at some flaw of ours, and thus we would live in fear of the other's scorn. In this mirror, perhaps one day you will see what you are seeking." As they were about to fall asleep, Boydie said, his eyes moist, "Let's stay here." "A fine figure you'd cut, naked as a worm," the poet replied. "Maybe we want too much," Rabbi Solomon said, "but at this point we can't help wanting it." They set off again the next morning. 27. Buandulino in the darkness of Abkhazia. After leaving the gymnosophists, they wandered at length, always asking themselves which was the path that led to the Sambation without passing through those horrible places that had been mentioned. But to no avail. They crossed plains, they forded streams, they struggled up steep cliffs, as Arjruni from time to time made calculations based on the map of Cosmos and declared that the Tigris or the Euphrates or the Ganges should not be far off. The poet told him to shut up, nasty black creature. Solomon repeated to him that sooner or later he would be white again, and the days and the months went by, each like the last. Once they camped beside a pond. The water was not very clear, but it would suffice, and the horses specially benefited by it. All were preparing for sleep when the moon rose and, in the light of its first rays, they saw in the shadows a sinister teeming, an infinite number of scorpions, all with the tips of their tails erect, in search of water, and they were followed by a band of snakes of a great variety of colors. Some had red scales, others black and white, still others gleamed like gold. The whole zone was a single hissing, and an immense terror gripped the men. They formed a circle, their swords pointed outwards, trying to kill those malignant plagues before they could approach their barrier. But the snakes and the scorpions were more attracted by the water than by them, and when they had drunk their fill they gradually withdrew to their lairs in cracks in the earth. At midnight, as the men were thinking they might get some sleep, crested serpents arrived, each with 2 or 3 heads. With their scales they swept the ground and they kept their jaws wide open, within which 3 tongues darted. Their stink was perceptible at a mile's distance, and all had the impression that their eyes, which sparkled in the lunar light, spread poison, as, for that matter, the basilisk does. The men fought them for an hour, because these animals were more aggressive than the others, and perhaps were seeking meat. They killed some and other snakes attacked the corpses, feasting and forgetting the humans. The friends were by now convinced they had overcome this danger, when, after the snakes, the crabs arrived, more than 100, covered with crocodile scales, and their armor repelled the sword's blows. But then Calandrino had an idea inspired by desperation. He approached one of them, gave him a violent kick just below the belly, and the animal rolled on its back, wildly waving its claws. So they could surround them, scatter branches over them, and set them afire. Then they realized that, once stripped of their armor, they were good to eat, and so for 2 days they had a supply of sweet and chewy meat, actually quite good and nutritious. Another time they really did encounter the basilisk, and it was, just as certain oft-told tales had narrated, undoubtedly true. It emerged from a cliff, splitting the rock, as Pliny had said. It had a cock's head and talons, and in the place of a crest it had a red excrescence, in the shape of a crown, yellow protruding eyes like a toad's, and a snake's body. It was emerald green, with silver glints, and at first sight it seemed almost beautiful, but everyone knew that its breath could poison an animal or human being, and already at a distance you could catch its horrible smell. "Keep away," Solomon cried, "and above all, don't look into its eyes, because they also give off a poisonous power." The basilisk crawled towards them. The odor became more and more intolerable, until Buandulino realized there was a way to kill it. The mirror," he shouted to Abdul. Abdul handed him the metal mirror he had received from the gymnosophists. Buandulino took it, and with his right hand he held it in front of himself like a shield, turned towards the monster, while with his left hand he covered his eyes to protect himself against that sight, and he measured his steps according to what he saw on the ground. He stopped before the beast, held the mirror out farther. Drawn by those glints, the basilisk raised his head and fixed his lizard eyes directly on this shining surface, exhaling his horrendous breath. But immediately his whole body trembled, he blinked his purple eyelids, let out a terrible cry, and sank down dead. All of them then remembered that the mirror reflects to the basilisk the power of his own gaze as well as the flow of breath he emits, and of these 2 wonders he himself remains the victim. "We are already in a land of monsters," the poet said, quite happily. "The kingdom is coming closer and closer." Buandulino no longer knew whether, in saying kingdom, he was still thinking of the priest's realm, or of his own, future, kingdom. And so, encountering anthropophage hippopotami one day, and bats bigger than pigeons the next, they came to a village amid the mountains. At its foot stretched a plain with scarce trees, which at close range seemed immersed in a light mist, but then the mist grew more and more dense, gradually becoming a dark and impenetrable cloud, transformed at the horizon into a single very black strip that contrasted with the red stripes of the sunset. The inhabitants were cordial, but to learn their language, made up entirely of guttural sounds, Buandulino needed several days, in the course of which they were housed and fed on the flesh of certain mountain hare, abundant among those cliffs. When the people could be understood, they said that at the foot of the mountain began the vast province of Abkhazia, which had 4 characteristics. It was a sole, immense forest where the deepest darkness always reigned, but not as if it were night, where at least you have the glow of the starry sky, but truly a solid darkness, as if you were at the bottom of a cave with your eyes closed. This province without light was inhabited by the Abkhazians, who lived there comfortably, as do the blind in the places where they have grown up since infancy. It seems they oriented themselves through hearing and smell, but no one knew what they were like, because no one had ever dared venture into the region. The friends asked if there were other ways to continue eastwards, and the people said yes, it sufficed to skirt Abkhazia and its forest, but this, as the ancient tales narrated, would require more than 10 years of travel, because the dark forest extended for 112 salamok, not that it was possible to understand how long a salamok was for them, but certainly more than a mile, a stadium, or a parasang. They were about to give up, when Porcelli, who had always been the most silent member of the party, reminded Buandulino that they, who came from Freshetta, were accustomed to proceed through fogs you could cut with a knife, which were worse than thick darkness, because in that grayness you could see, through tricks of your weary eyes, forms arise that didn't exist in the real world, and therefore even where you could have proceeded you had to stop, and if you succumbed to the mirage you changed path and fell over a cliff. "And in our fog at home, what do?" he said. "Why, you go ahead on your own judgment, instinct, guesswork, like bats, who are blind to everything, and you can't even follow your sense of smell, because the fog gets into your nostrils and the only thing you smell is the smell of fog. So, he concluded, if you're used to fog, solid darkness is like walking in daylight." The other Alessandrians agreed, and so it was Buandulino and his 5 neighbors who led the group, while each of the others tied himself to his horse and followed, hoping for the best. At the beginning they advanced easily, because it really did seem they were in the fog of their home country, but after a few hours it was pitch black. The guides pricked up their ears to hear a sound of boughs, and when they could hear it no longer they surmised they had entered a clearing. The villagers had said that in those lands a strong wind blew always from south towards north, and so every now and then Buandulino moistened a finger, held it in the air, and felt the direction of the wind, then turned east. They became aware of night falling because the air grew colder, and they would then stop to rest, a useless decision, the poet said, because in such a place you could just as well rest in the daytime. But Ardzruni pointed out that, when it was cold, you no longer heard animal noises, and you began hearing them again, especially the bird's song, when the first warmth arrived. A sign that all living things, in Abkhazia, measured the day according to the alternation of cold and warmth, as if they were the appearance of the moon or the sun. For many long days they sensed no human presences. When their supplies were exhausted, they stretched out their hands to touch the branches of the trees, and, groping branch after branch, sometimes for hours, they would find a fruit, which they ate, trusting that it was not poisonous. Often it was the acrid aroma of some vegetal wonder that gave Buandulino, whose sense of smell was the most refined, a clue to deciding whether to continue straight ahead or to turn right or left. As the days passed all became more alert. El Aramo Scotchabarosi known as Bonehead had a bow, and he kept it taut until he heard in front of him the flapping of some bird less swift and perhaps less airborne than our hens at home. He would shoot the arrow, and, most times, guided by a cry or a frenzied fluttering of dying wings, they could seize the prey, pluck the feathers, and cook it over a fire of twigs. The most amazing thing was that, rubbing some stones together, they could kindle the wood. The flame rose, suitably red, but illuminating nothing, not even the men gathered around it, and then it would break off at the point where, skewered on a bough, they set the animal to be roasted. It was not hard to find water, because fairly often they heard the gurgle of some spring or rill. They advanced very slowly, and one time they realized that, after 2 days' journey, they were back at the place from which they had set out, because, near a little stream, as they groped around, they came upon the traces of their previous encampment. Finally they sensed the presence of the Abkhasians. First they heard voices, like whispering, all around them, excited voices, though still faint, as if the forest's inhabitants were pointing out to one another these unexpected visitors they had never seen, or, rather, never heard. The poet let out a very loud cry, and the voices fell silent, while a stirring of grass and boughs suggested the Abkhasians were fleeing in fear. But they came back, and resumed their whispering, more and more amazed by this invasion. At a certain moment the poet felt a hand graze him, or a hairy limb. He gripped something and heard a scream of terror. The poet let go, and the voices of the natives moved off a bit, as if they had widened their circle, to remain at a safe distance. Nothing happened for several days. The journey continued and the Abkhasians accompanied them, though perhaps they were not the same ones as the first time, but others who had been told of their passage. In fact, one night, was it night? They heard in the distance something like a roll of drums, or a sound as if someone were beating a hollow tree trunk. It was a soft noise, but it spread through the space around them, for miles perhaps, and they understood that with this system the Abkhasians kept one another informed, at a distance, about what was happening in their forest. At length they became accustomed to that invisible company. And they were growing more and more accustomed to the darkness, so much so that Abdul, who had particularly suffered from the sun's rays, said he felt better, his fever almost gone, and went back to his songs. One evening, was it evening? While he was warming himself at the fire, he took his instrument from his saddle and resumed singing. Happy and sad, at the end of my road, I hope to see my distant love. Will I see her? I don't know, where'er I go. I will be too far from her. Hard is the pass and harsh my way. Nor shall I ever know my destiny. May the Lord's will be done. But to me it will seem great joy, as I implore. Through love of God, the distant refuge. If she please, I will find refreshment there. Near her, far though she be. And this song of mine, faint and fine. If I have the joy to be near her, this song will bring sweetness to my heart. They became aware that the Abkhasians, who till then had murmured around them without cease, had fallen silent. They listened in silence to Abdul's song, then tried to reply. 100 lips, were they lips? Were heard whistling, piping charmingly like tame blackbirds, repeating the melody Abdul had played. Thus they found a wordless accord with their hosts, and in the nights that followed each group awaited the other, one singing and the other apparently playing flutes. Once the poet roughly bawled one of those tavern songs that in Paris made even the serving wenches blush, and Buandulino joined in. The Abkhasians did not respond, but after a long silence one or two of them resumed imitating Abdul's melodies, as if to say those were good and acceptable, not the others. In this they displayed, Abdul observed, a tenderness of feeling and an ability to tell good music from bad. As the only one authorized to speak with the Abkhasians, Abdul felt reborn. We are in the reign of tenderness, he said, and therefore close to my goal. Let's move on. No, Boydie replied, fascinated, why don't we stay here? Is there perhaps any place more beautiful in the world than this, where, even if something ugly exists, you don't see it? Buandulino also thought that, after he had seen so many things in the vast world, those long days spent in darkness had reconciled him to himself. In the darkness he returned to his memories, he thought of his boyhood, of his father, his mother, of Calandrina so sweet and unhappy. One evening, was it evening? Yes, because the Abkhazans were silent, sleeping. Unable to get to sleep, he moved, touching the tree's fronds with his hands, as if he were seeking something. Suddenly he found a fruit, soft to the touch and very aromatic. He picked it and bit into it, and he felt invaded by a sudden languor. He no longer knew if he was dreaming or awake. All at once he saw, or felt close to him as if he saw her, Calandrina. Buandulino, Buandulino, she called him with an adolescent voice, don't stop, even if here everything seems beautiful. You must reach the kingdom of that priest you told me about and give him that cup. Otherwise we will make a duke of our Buandulineto Calandrinuccio. Make me happy. Things are not bad here, but I miss you so. Calandrina, Calandrina, Buandulino cried, or thought he cried, be quiet. You are a ghost, a trick, the fruit of that fruit. The dead do not return. Generally not, Calandrina replied, but I kept insisting. I said, you gave me only one season with my man, only a taste. Do me this holy favor, if you have a heart. I'm fine here, and I see the Blessed Virgin and all the saints, but I miss the caresses of my Buandulino that gave me goosebumps. They've granted me very little time, just to give you a kiss. Buandulino, don't stop along the way with the women of those places, who maybe have nasty diseases that I don't even know of. Put your foot in the road and go towards the sun. She disappeared, as Buandulino felt a soft touch on his cheek. He stirred from his doze, had peaceful dreams. The next day he told his companions that they had to go on. After many more days they perceived a glimmer, a milky glow. Again the darkness was being transformed into the gray of a thick and uniform broom. They realized that the Abkhazans, who were accompanying them, had stopped, and were bidding them farewell with their piping. They heard them standing at the edge of a clearing, at the confines of that light that the Abkhazans surely feared, as if they were waving their hands, and from the softness of their sounds it was clear they were smiling. They passed through the fog and saw once more the light of the sun. They were dazzled, and Abdul was again shaken by feverish trembling. They thought that after the test of Abkhazia they would enter the desired lands, but they had to revise that idea. Immediately, above their heads, birds with human faces were darting and shouting, on what soil are you treading? Go back, you cannot violate the land of the blessed. Go back and tread the land that was given you. The poet said this was witchcraft, perhaps one of the ways the land of the priest was protected, and he convinced them to go on. After a few days' march over a field of stones without a blade of grass, they saw 3 animals coming towards them. One was surely a cat, with an arched back, bristling fur, and eyes like 2 firebrands. Another had a lion's head, roaring, a goat's body, and the behind of a dragon, but from the goat-like back a second head rose, horned and bleeding. The tail was a hissing serpent, thrust forward to threaten the travelers. The third had a lion's body, a scorpion's tail, and an almost human head, with shapely nose and yawning mouth, in which they could discern, above and below, a triple row of teeth, sharp as blades. The animal that most worried them was the cat, notoriously the messenger of Satan and the domestic ally of necromancers. You can defend yourself against any monster, but not against this one, who, before you can draw your sword, springs on your face and scratches your eyes. Solomon muttered that nothing good could be expected of an animal that the Book of Books had never mentioned. Boron said that the second animal was surely a chimera, the only one that, if a vacuum existed, could fly buzzing inside it and suck out the thoughts of living beings. The third animal left no room for doubt, and Buandulino recognized it as a manticore, not unlike the lucrota, an animal about which some time ago, how long was it now, he had written to Beatrice. The 3 monsters advanced towards them, the cat with agile feline steps, the other 2 with equal determination, but a bit slower, thanks to the difficulty that a triform animal has in adapting to the movement of its various composition. The first to take the initiative was a Laramo Scotchabarosi known as Bonehead, who now was never separated from his bow. He fired an arrow right in the center of the cat's head, and the animal sprawled lifeless. At this sight, the chimera made a leap forward. Bravely, Cutica of Quarnento, shouting that at home he had been able to reduce enamored bulls to mild behavior, stepped forward to stab the monster, but it made a leap, fell upon him, and was tearing him with its leonine maw when the poet, Buandulino, and Calandrino rushed to subdue the beast with slashes of their swords until it let go and sank to the ground. Meanwhile the manticore attacked. It was confronted by Boron, Kayat, Boidi, and Porcelli, while Solomon hurled stones at it, muttering curses in his holy language. Ardzruni retreated, black also with terror, and Abdul lay curled up, seized by more intense tremors. The beast seemed to consider the situation with a canniness both human and bestial. Surprisingly agile, it ducked those facing it and, before they could inflict a wound, it flung itself on Abdul, unable to defend himself. With its tripled teeth it bit his shoulder, nor did it let go when the others rushed to free their comrade. It howled beneath the blows of their swords, but firmly clenched Abdul's body, which spurted blood from a spreading wound. Finally the monster could no longer survive the blows inflicted by the 4 enraged adversaries, and with a horrible rattle it died. But it was hard work opening its jaws and freeing Abdul from their grip. At the end of that battle, Cutica had a wounded arm, but Solomon was treating him with an unguent of his, saying the wound would not be serious. Abdul, on the contrary, was moaning faintly, losing much blood. Bandage him, Buandulino said. Weak as he was already, he mustn't go on bleeding. They all tried to staunch the flow, using their clothes to stop the wound, but the manticore had bitten deep into his limbs, reaching the heart. Abdul was delirious. He murmured that his princess must be very near and he couldn't die right at this very moment. He asked them to stand him on his feet, and they had to restrain him because it was clear that the monster had injected some unknown poison into his flesh. Believing in his own deceit, Ardzruni had taken from Abdul's sack the Baptist head, broken the seal, removed the skull from the reliquary, and placed it in Abdul's hands. "Pray," he said, "pray for your salvation." "Imbecile," the poet said to him scornfully. "First of all, he can't hear you, and, second, that head was God knows whose, and you stole it from some infidel graveyard." "Any relic can revive the spirit of a dying man," Ardzruni said. In the late afternoon Abdul could no longer see, and he asked if they were again in the forest of Abkhazia. Realizing that the supreme moment was coming, Buandulino made up his mind and, as usual out of good-heartedness, told another lie. "Abdul," he said, "now you are at the peak of your desires. You have arrived at the place you yearned for, you had only to pass the test of the manticore. Here, you see, your lady is before you. As she learned of your ill-starred love, from the farthest reaches of the earth where she lives, she has hastened to you, thrilled and moved by your devotion." "No," Abdul gasped, "it's not possible. She comes to me, and I do not go to her. How can I survive such bounty? Tell her to wait. Raise me, please, that I may go and pay her homage." "Be calm, my friend. If she has so decided, you must bow to her will. Here, open your eyes, she is bending over you." And, as Abdul raised his eyelids, Buandulino held out to his gaze, now clouded, the mirror of the gymnosophists, in which the dying man glimpsed, perhaps, the shadow of a countenance that was not unknown to him. "I see you, my lady," he said in a faint voice, "for the first and last time. I never believed I could merit this joy. But I fear that you love me, and this could sat my passion. Oh no, princess. Now this is too much. Why do you bend to kiss me?" And he put his trembling lips to the mirror. "What do I feel now? Sadness at the end of my search or pleasure for the undeserved conquest? I love you, Abdul, let that suffice." Buandulino had the courage to whisper into the ear of his friend, who was dying, and the friend smiled. "Yes, you love me, and that suffices. Isn't it what I have always wished, even if I dispelled the thought for fear it would happen? Or what I did not wish, for fear that it would not be as I had hoped? But now I could desire nothing more. How beautiful you are, my princess, and how red are your lips." He let the false skull of the Baptist roll on the ground, grasped with trembling hand the mirror, and moved his lips, in vain, to graze the mirror's surface, clouded by his breath. "Today we celebrate a joyous death, that of my sorrow. Oh, sweet lady, you have been my sun and my light, where you passed it was spring, and in May you were the moon that enchanted my nights." He came to, for a moment, and said, trembling, "But is it perhaps a dream?" "Abdul," Buandulino whispered to him, remembering some verses he had one day sung, "what is life if not the shadow of a fleeting dream?" "Thank you, my love," Abdul said. He made a final effort, as Buandulino supported his head, and he kissed the mirror 3 times. Then he bowed his now bloodless, waxen face, illuminated by the light of the sun that was setting over the fields of stones. The Alessandrians dug a grave. Buandulino, the poet, Boron, and Kayat, who were weeping for a friend with whom they had shared everything from the years of their youth, lowered the poor remains into the earth. On his chest they set that instrument which would never more sing the praises of the distant princess, and they covered his face with the gymnosophist's mirror. Buandulino collected the skull and the gilded case, then went to fetch his friend's sack, where he found a roll of parchment with his songs. He was about to place the Baptist skull, which he had put back in the reliquary, also in the bag. Then he said to himself, "If he goes to paradise, as I hope, he won't need it, because he will meet the Baptist, the real one, head and all the rest. And in any case, in those parts it's best for him not to be found with a relic that couldn't be more fake. I'll keep this myself, and if one day I sell it, I'll use the money to have made for him, if not a tomb, at least a fine plaque in a Christian church." He closed the reliquary, replacing the seal as best he could, and put it, along with his own, in his sack. For a moment he had the feeling he was robbing a dead man, but he decided after all he was borrowing something he would repay in another form. In any case he said nothing to the others. He collected everything else in Abdul's sack and went to lay it in the grave. They filled the grave and set there, like a cross, their friend's sword. Buandulino, the poet, Boron, and Kayat knelt in prayer, while at a slight distance Solomon murmured the litanies that the Jews habitually recite. The others remained a bit behind. Boydie wanted to begin a sermon, but then limited himself to saying, "HMPH. When you think that just a few minutes ago he was here with us," Porcelli said. "We're here today and gone tomorrow," said Alaramo Scacciabarozzi, known as Bonehead. "Why him, I wonder," Cutica said. "Fate," concluded Calandrino, who, though still young, was very wise. 28. Buandulino crosses the Sambadion. Hallelujah, Nikitas cried after 3 days marching. "There, over there is Selembria, decked in trophies." And with trophies it was truly decked, that little city of low houses and deserted streets, because, as they learned later, they were celebrating the day after the feast of some saint or archangel. The inhabitants had festooned a tall white column that stood in a field at the edge of the settlement, and Nikitas explained to Buandulino that on the top of that column, centuries and centuries ago, a hermit had lived, who had not come down from it until after his death, and from up there he had performed numerous miracles. But nowadays men of that stamp no longer existed, and this, too, was perhaps one of the reasons for the misfortunes of the empire. They headed at once for the house of the friend on whom Nikitas was relying, and this Theophylactus, an elderly man, hospitable and jovial, welcomed them with genuinely fraternal affection. He inquired about their mishaps, wept with them over destroyed Constantinople, showed them his house with many rooms for the whole brigade of guests, refreshed them immediately with young wine and a plentiful salad with olives and cheese. These were not the delicacies to which Nikitas was accustomed, but this rustic lunch was more than enough to make them forget the discomforts of the journey and their distant home. Remain in the house for a few days without wandering about, Theophylactus advised them. Many refugees from Constantinople have arrived here, and these people of ours have never got along with the people of the capital. Now you are here to ask alms, you who gave yourselves such airs, is what they are saying. And for a crust of bread they demand its weight in gold. But if only that were all. Some time ago pilgrims also arrived here. First they acted the bully. You can imagine how they are now, when they have learned that Constantinople is theirs and one of their leaders will become the basileus. They strut around dressed in festive clothes they have stolen from our dignitaries, they put the mitres stolen from the churches on the heads of their horses, and they sing our hymns in a Greek they've invented, mixing in who knows what obscene words from their own language, they cook their food in our sacred vessels, and they parade the streets with their whores dressed like great ladies. Sooner or later, this too will pass, but for the present stay quietly here with me. Buandulino and Nikitas asked for nothing better. In the days that followed, Buandulino continued his story beneath the olive trees. They had cool wine and olives, and more olives to savor, whetting their thirst. Nikitas was anxious to know if they finally arrived at the kingdom of Prester John. Yes and no, Buandulino said. In any case, before telling where they arrived, it was necessary to cross the Sambadion. And this was the adventure he began at once to recount. As he had been tender and pastoral in telling of Abdul's death, so now he was epic and majestic in reporting the fording of that river. A sign, Nikitas thought once again, that Buandulino was like that strange animal of which he, Nikitas, had only heard rumors, though perhaps Buandulino had even seen it. The so-called chameleon, similar to a tiny goat, which changes color according to the place where it is, and can vary from black to pale green. White, the color of innocence, is the only color it cannot assume. Saddened after the death of their comrade, the travelers resumed their march and again found themselves at the beginning of a mountainous region. As they advanced they heard first a distant sound, then a crackling, a noise that became increasingly audible and distinct, as if someone were throwing a great number of boulders and pebbles from the peaks, and the avalanche were dragging with it earth and rubble, rumbling downwards. Then they made out a cloud of dust, like a mist or broom. But, unlike a great mass of humidity, which would have darkened the rays of the sun, this gave off myriad glints, as if the sun's rays were striking against a fluttering of mineral atoms. At a certain point Rabbi Solomon was the first to understand. It's the Sambadion, he shouted, so we are close to our goal. It was indeed the river of stone, as they realized when they arrived at its banks, dazed by the great din that almost prevented them from hearing one another's words. It was a majestic course of rocks and clods, flowing ceaselessly, and in that current of great shapeless masses could be discerned irregular slabs, sharp as blades, broad as tombstones, and between them, gravel, fossils, peaks, and crags. Moving at the same speed, as if driven by an impetuous wind, fragments of travertine rolled over and over, great faults sliding above, then, their impetus lessening, they bounced off streams of spall, while little chips now round, smoothed as if by water in their sliding between boulder and boulder, leapt up, falling back with sharp sounds, to be caught in those same eddies they themselves had created, crashing and grinding. Amid and above this overlapping of mineral, puffs of sand were formed, gusts of chalk, clouds of lapilli, foam of pumice, rills of mire. Here and there sprays of shards, volleys of coals, fell on the bank, and the travelers had to cover their faces so as not to be scarred. What day is today? Buandulino shouted to his companions. Solomon, who kept the tally of every Saturday, remembered that the week had just begun, and for the river to halt its flow they would have to wait at least 6 days. And then, when it stops, we won't be able to cross it, in violation of the Sabbath laws, he cried, distraught. Why did the Holy One, may his name be forever blessed, in his wisdom not cause this river to stop on Sunday, since you Gentiles are all unbelievers anyway and you trample the festive repose under your feet? Don't worry about Saturday, Buandulino cried. For if the river were to stop, I would know very well how to make you cross it without causing you to sin. I would just prop you on a mule while you're asleep. The problem is what you yourself told us. When the river stops flowing, along the banks a barrier of flames springs up, so we're back at the beginning. It's useless then to wait here for 6 days. Let's go towards the source, and perhaps there is a crossing place before the river is born. What? His companions cried, not understanding any of it, but then, seeing him move, they followed, thinking that perhaps he had a good idea. On the contrary, it was a very bad one, because they rode for 6 days, seeing that the river's bed did, indeed, narrow, becoming first a stream and then a creek, but they arrived at the source only towards the 5th day. By then, for 2 days they had seen above the horizon an impervious chain of high mountains, which loomed over the travelers, almost blocking their view of the sky, crammed as they were in an ever narrower passage, with no exit, from which, way above, could now be seen only a great cloud barely luminescent that gnawed the top of those peaks. Here, from a fissure, like a wound between two mountains, they saw the Sambadion springing up. A roiling of sandstone, a gurgling of tuff, a dripping of muck, a ticking of shards, a grumbling of clotted earth, an overflowing of clods, a rain of clay, all gradually transformed into a steady flow, which began its journey towards some boundless ocean of sand. Our friends spent a day trying to skirt the mountains and discover a pass above the source, but in vain. They were in fact threatened by sudden moraines that came and shattered at the hoofs of their horses. They had to take a more tortuous path. Night caught them in a place where every now and then blocks of living sulfur rolled from the peak. Farther on, the heat became unbearable, and they realized that, if they continued, even if they found a way to cross the mountains, when the water of their flasks was finished in that dead nature, they would find no form of humidity, so they decided to turn back. But they discovered they had become lost in those meanders, and it took them another day to find the source again. They arrived when, according to Solomon's calculations, Saturday had already passed and, even if the river had stopped, it had now already resumed its course, and they would have to wait another 6 days. Uttering exclamations that certainly did not assure them the benevolence of heaven, they decided to follow the river, in the hope that it would open into a mouth, or delta, or estuary as might be, transforming itself into a more restful wasteland. So they traveled for some dawns and some sunsets, moving away from the banks to find more welcoming zones, and heaven must have forgotten their abuses, because they came upon a little oasis with some greenery and a very meager pool of water, still sufficient to give them relief and a supply for a few more days. Then they went on, always accompanied by the flow of the river, under glowing skies occasionally striped with black clouds, fine and flat as the stones of Bubuktar. Until, after almost 5 days' travel, and nights as sultry as the days, they realized that the continuous churn of that tide was changing. The river had assumed a greater speed, in its flow something like currents were visible, rapids that dragged along shreds of basalt like straws, a distant thunder was heard. Then, more and more impetuous, the Sambadion subdivided into myriad streamlets, which penetrated among mountainous slopes like the fingers of a hand in a clump of mud. At times a wave was swallowed by a grotto, then, from a sort of rocky passage that seemed impassable, it emerged with a roar and flung itself angrily towards the valley. Abruptly, after a vast curve they were forced to make because the banks had become impervious, lashed by granite whirlwinds, the friends reached the top of a plateau, and saw the Sambadion below them, annihilated in a sort of maw of hell. There were cataracts that plunged down from dozens of rocky eaves arranged like an amphitheater into a boundless final vortex, an incessant retching of granite, an eddy of bitumen, a sole undertow of alum, a churning of schist, a clash of orpiment against the banks. And on the matter that the vortex erupted towards the sky, below with respect to the eyes of those who looked down as if from the top of a tower, the sun's rays formed on those silicious droplets an immense rainbow that, as every body reflected the rays with varying splendor according to its own nature, had many more colors than those usually formed in the sky after a storm, and, unlike them, seemed destined to shine eternally, never dissolving. It was a reddening of hematrites and cinnabars, a glow of blackness as if it were steel, a flight of crumbs of aureopigment from yellow to bright orange, a blueness of armenium, a whiteness of calcinated shells, a greening of malachite, a fading of lyothyrgerium into saffrons ever paler, a blare of risigalum, a belching of greenish earth that faded into dust of chrysocolla and then transmigrated into nuances of indigo and violet, a triumph of aurum musivum, a purpling of burnt white lead, a flaring of sandraca, a couch of silvered clay, a single transparence of alabaster. No human voice could make itself heard in that clangor, nor did the travelers have any desire to speak. They witnessed the death agony of the Sambadion, enraged at having to vanish into the bowels of the earth, trying to take with it all that surrounded it, clenching its stones to express all its impotence. Neither Buandulino nor his friends realized how long they admired the wraths of the precipice where the river was unwillingly buried, but they must have lingered there at length, and the sunset of Friday had arrived, hence the beginning of Saturday. Because all of a sudden, as if at a command, the river stiffened in cadaveric rigidity, and the vortex at the bottom of the abyss was changed into a scaly, inert valley where, sudden and terrifying, an enormous silence reigned. They waited, expecting, as foretold by the story they had heard, a barrier of flames to rise along the banks. But nothing happened. The river was silent, the whirling particles above it slowly settled into its bed, the night sky became serene, displaying a glitter of stars till then hidden. So you see, you mustn't always believe what they tell you, Buandulino concluded. We live in a world where people invent the most incredible stories. Solomon, this is a tale you Jews put into circulation to prevent Christians from coming to these parts. Solomon did not answer, because he was a man of quick intelligence, and at that moment he understood that Buandulino was pondering how to make him cross the river. I will not fall asleep, he said at once. Don't think about it, Buandulino replied. Rest, while we look for a ford. Solomon would have liked to flee, but on Saturday he couldn't ride, still less travel over mountainous heights. So he remained seated all night, striking his head with his fists and cursing his fate and, with it, the accursed Gentiles. The following morning, when the others picked out a place where they could cross without risk, Buandulino went back to Solomon, smiled at him with affectionate understanding, and struck him with a club just behind the ear. And so it was that Rabbi Solomon, alone among the sons of Israel, crossed the Sambadion on the Sabbath in his sleep. 29. Buandulino arrives at Pandapedzum. Crossing the Sambation did not mean they had arrived in the kingdom of Prester John. It meant simply that they had abandoned known lands where only the boldest travelers had gone. In fact, the friends had to proceed for many more days still, and through lands at least as rough as the banks of that river of stone. Then they reached a plain that was endless. On the far horizon they could make out a mountainous presence, fairly low, but jagged with peaks slender as fingers, which reminded Buandulino of the Alps when he had crossed them as a boy on the eastern slope, to travel from Italy into Germany. But those were far higher and more imposing. The rise was, however, at the extreme horizon, and in that plain the horses advanced toilsomely because a hardy vegetation grew everywhere, like an endless field of ripe wheat, except that this was a species of green and yellow fern, taller than a man, and that sort of very fertile steppe stretched as far as the eye could see, like an ocean stirred by a constant breeze. As they crossed a clearing, like an island in that ocean, they saw in the distance and in a single place that the surface no longer moved in uniform waves, but was agitated irregularly, as if some animal, an enormous hare, moved in sinuous curves and not in a straight line, at a speed superior to that of any hare. Since these adventurers had already encountered animals, and of a sort that inspired no confidence, they tugged on their reins, and prepared for a new battle. The serpentine line was coming towards them, and they could hear a rustle of disturbed ferns. At the edge of the clearing the grasses finally parted, and a creature appeared, thrusting the ferns aside with its hands, as if they were a curtain. Hands they certainly were, and arms, those of the being coming towards them. For the rest it had a leg, but only one. Not that the other had been amputated, on the contrary, the single leg was attached naturally to the body, as if there had never been a place for another, and with the single foot of that single leg the creature could run with great ease, as if accustomed to moving in that way since birth. Indeed, as he came swiftly towards them, they couldn't tell if he moved in hops or managed, built as he was, to make steps, and his one leg went forwards and backwards, as we move with two, and every step bore him ahead. The speed with which he advanced was such that it was impossible to distinguish one movement from another, as with horses, of whom no one has ever been able to say if there is a moment when all four hoofs are raised from the ground, or if two at least are always firmly planted. When the creature stopped before them, they saw that his sole foot was at least twice the size of a human foot, but well-shaped, with square nails, and 5 toes that seemed all thumbs, squat and sturdy. For the rest, he was the height of a child of 10 or 12 years, that is he came up to a human waist, and had a shapely head, with short, bristling yellow hair on top, a pair of round affectionate eyes like those of an ox, a small snub nose, a broad mouth that stretched almost ear to ear and revealed, in what was undoubtedly a smile, a fine and strong set of teeth. Buandulino and his friends recognized him at once, for they had read about the creature and heard him spoken of many times. He was a sciopod, and they had even put sciapods in the priest's letter. The sciopod smiled again, raised both hands, clasping them above his head in a greeting and, erect as a statue on his single foot, he said, more or less, Alaikum Sabi, Yani Kala Benser. This is a language I've never heard, Buandulino said. Then, in Greek, he said, what language are you speaking? The sciopod replied in a Greek all his own, I not know what language spoke. I believe you foreigners and spoke a language made up like foreigners. But you speak language of Presbyter Johannes and his deacon. I greet you. I is Gavagai, at your service. Seeing that Gavagai was harmless, indeed benevolent, Buandulino and the others dismounted and sat on the ground, inviting him to do the same and offering him what little food they still had. No, he said, I thank, but I have ate very much this morning. Then he did something that, according to the best tradition, was to be expected from a sciopod. He first stretched out full length on the ground, then raised his leg so as to provide himself with shade from his foot, put his hands behind his head and again smiled blissfully, as if he were lying under an umbrella. Some cool is good today, after much running. But you, who is? Too bad, if you was 12, then you was the most holy magi returning, even with one black. Too bad only 11. Too bad indeed, Buandulino said, but we are 11. 11 magi don't interest you, I suppose. 11 magi no interest anybody. Every morning in church we pray return of the 12. If 11 come we prayed wrong. Here they really are awaiting the magi, the poet murmured to Buandulino. We have to find a way to persuade them that number 12 is around somewhere. But without ever using the word magi, Buandulino insisted. We are 12, and they'll think the rest on their own. Otherwise Prester John will discover who we are and will have us eaten by his white lions or something like. Then he addressed Gavagai again. You said you are a servant of the presbyter. Have we then come to the kingdom of Prester John? You wait, you cannot say. Here I am in kingdom of Prester John, after you have come a little way. Then everybody come. You are in great province of Deacon Johannes, son of Johannes, and rules all this land that you, if you want the presbyter's kingdom, have to pass through. All visitors coming must first wait in. Pandapedzum, great capital of Deacon. How many visitors have already arrived here? None. You people first. Really? Before us, a man with a black beard didn't arrive? I never seen, Gavagai said. You men first. So we must stay in this province to wait for Zosimos, the poet grumbled, and God knows if he will arrive. Maybe he's still in Abkhazia, groping around in the dark. It would have been worse if he had already arrived and had given the grazel to these people, Kayat said. But without the Grazel, how will we present ourselves? Stay calm. Even haste demands some time, Boydie wisely observed. Now we'll see what we find here, then we'll think up something. Buandulino told Gavagai that they would gladly stay in Pandapedzum, waiting for their 12th companion, who had been lost in a desert sandstorm many days' march from where they were now. He asked Gavagai where the deacon lived. Down there, in his palace. I take you. No, first I tell my friends you arrive, and when you arrive there is feast. Guest is the Lord's gift. Are there other sciapods around here in the grass? I don't believe, but just now I saw Blemmy that I know. By chance, because sciapods not friends of Blemmy. He put his fingers to his mouth and emitted a long and very well modulated whistle. After a few instants the ferns parted and another creature appeared. He was very different from the sciapod and, for that matter, having heard of Blemmy mentioned, the friends were expecting to see what they saw. The creature, with very broad shoulders, was hence very squat, but with slim waist, 2 legs, short and hairy, and no head, or even a neck. On his chest, where men have nipples, there were 2 almond-shaped eyes, darting, and, beneath a slight swelling with 2 nostrils, a kind of circular hole, very ductile, so that when he spoke he made it assume various shapes, according to the sounds it was emitting. Gavagai went to confer with him, pointing out the visitors. The other creature visibly nodded, by bending his shoulders as if he were leaning over. He approached the visitors and said something like, we oi, aewa. As a sign of friendship, the visitors offered him a cup of water. From a sack he was carrying the Blemmy took something like a straw, stuck it in the hole beneath his nose, and began to suck the water. Then Buandulino offered him a large piece of cheese. The Blemmy put it to his mouth, which suddenly became the same size as the cheese, which vanished into that hole. The Blemmy said, Uaioia. Then he put a hand on his chest, or rather, on his forehead, like someone making a promise, waved both arms, and went off through the grass. He arrived before us, Gavagai said. Blemmy not run like sciapods, but always better than slow animals you go upon. What is they? Horses, Buandulino said, remembering that horses did not live in the priest's kingdom. How is horses? The curious sciapod asked. Like these, the poet replied, exactly like them. I thank you men powerful and go with animals like horses. But listen a moment, just now I heard you say that sciapods are not friends of Blemmy. Do they not belong to the same kingdom or province? Oh, no, they servants of the presbyter like us, and like them also ponces, pygmies, giants, Phoenicians, tongueless, Nubians, eunuchs, and the satyrs that are never seen. All good Christians and faithful servants of deacon and presbyter. You are not friends because you are different? What you say, different? Well, in the sense that you are different from us in. Why different you? Oh, for God's sake, the poet said. To begin with, you have only 1 leg. We and the Blemmy have 2. Also you and Blemmy, if you raise 1 leg, you have only 1. But you don't have another one to lower. Why should I lower leg I don't has? Do you lower 3rd leg you don't has? Boydie intervened, conciliatory. Listen, Gavagai, you must agree that the Blemmy has no head. What, has no head? Has eyes, nose, mouth, speaks, eats. How possible if has no head? But haven't you noticed that he has no neck, and above the neck that round thing that you also have on your neck and he doesn't? What means noticed? Seen. Realized that. You know that. Maybe you say he not entirely same as me. My mother couldn't mistake him for me. But you too not the same as this friend because he has mark on cheek and you know. And your friend different from that other one black like one magi, and him different from that other with black beard like a rabbi. How do you know I have a rabbi's beard? Solomon asked hopefully, obviously thinking of the lost tribes, and deducing from those words a clear sign that they had passed through here or were living in this kingdom. Have you ever seen other rabbis? Me no, but all say rabbi's beard down in Pandapedzum. Boron said. Let's get to the point. This sciapod can't see the difference between himself and a Blemmy, any more than we can see any between Porcelli and Buandulino. If you think about it, this happens when you meet strangers. Between 2 Moors, can you see a real difference? Yes, Buandulino said, but a Blemmy and a sciapod aren't like us and Moors, since we see them only when we go to their country. They all live in the same province, and he can distinguish between one Blemmy and another if he says that the one we just saw is his friend and the other's not. Now listen to me carefully, Gavagai. You said that in the province live some Phoenicians. I know what the Phoenicians are. They're people almost like us, except they have 2 ears so huge that they come down to their knees, and when it's cold they wrap them around their body like a cloak. Is this how Phoenicians are? Yes, like us. I have ears, too. But not down to your knees, by God. You have ears much bigger than your friend next to you. But not like the Phoenicians, damn it. Each has the ears his mother made for him. Then why do you say that there is bad blood between the sciapods and the Blemmy? Blemmy think wrong. Wrong how? They Christians who make mistake. They fantasistoy. They say right, like us, that son not the same nature as father, because father exists since before time began, but son is created by father, not for need but for wish. So son is adoptive son of God, no? Blemmy say. Yes, son has not same nature as father, but this verbum even if only adoptive son cannot make himself flesh. So Jesus never became flesh. What apostles saw was only How to say? Phantasma. Pure appearance. There. They say only phantasma of son died on cross, not born in Bethlehem, not born of Maria, one day on river Jordan before John the Baptist he appear and all say oh. But if son not flesh, how he says this bread my body? And so they not make communion with bread and birk. Maybe because they would have to suck the wine, or whatever you call it, with that straw, the poet said. And the Penotians? Buandulino asked. Oh, they don't care what son does when he comes down to earth. They think only of Holy Spirit. I tell you. They say Christians in West think Holy Spirit proceeds from Father and from Son. They protest and say this from Son was put afterwards and in the credo of Constantinople it doesn't say. Holy Spirit for them proceeds only from Father. They think contrary to Pygmies. Pygmies says Holy Spirit proceeds only from Son and not from Father. Penotians hate most of all Pygmies. Friends, Buandulino said, turning to his companions, it seems obvious to me that the various races existing in this province give no importance to bodily differences, to color or shape, as we do, when even if we see a dwarf we consider him a horror of nature. But instead, like many of our learned men, for that matter, they attach great importance to the difference of ideas about Christ, or the most holy Trinity, of which we have heard so much talk in Paris. It is their way of thinking. We must try to understand this, otherwise we'll be forever lost in endless arguments. Very well, we'll pretend the Blemier are like the Sciapods, and what they think about the nature of our Lord doesn't concern us after all. From what I understand, the Sciapods share the terrible Arian heresy, Boron said, who, as always, was the one among them who had read the most books. So, the poet said, it seems to me a question for Greeklings. We in the north were more concerned about which pope was the real one, and which the antipope, insisting that it all depended on a whim of our late Lord Reynald. Everyone has his own defects. Buandulino's right. Let's act as if it were nothing and ask him to take us to his deacon, who won't amount to much but at least his name is John. They then asked Gabagai to take them to Pentapedzum, and he set off, hopping moderately, to allow the horses to keep up with him. After 2 hours they reached the end of the Sea of Fern and entered a cultivated area of olive and fruit groves. Below the trees were seated, looking at them with curiosity, some beings of almost human features, who greeted them with their hands while emitting only howls. They were, Gabagai explained, the tongueless, who lived outside the city because they were Messalians, believing you could go to heaven only thanks to silent and continuous prayer, without taking the sacraments, without performing works of mercy or other mortifications, without ritual practices. Therefore they never went to the churches of Pentapedzum. They were shunned by all because they believed that work was also an act of mercy and therefore useless. They lived in great poverty, feeding on the fruits of these trees, which, however, belonged to the whole community, and which they exploited without any restraint. Otherwise they're just like you, aren't they? The poet teased him. They're like us when we are silent. The mountains were coming closer all the time, and the closer they came, the more the friends grew aware of their nature. At the end of the rocky area, some soft, yellowish little mounds rose gradually, as if, Calandrino suggested, they were made of whipped cream. No, of piles of spun sugar. Wrong. Heaps of sand placed one next to the other, as if they were forest. Behind rose what had seemed in the distance fingers, rocky peaks, which at their top were capped with darker rock, sometimes in the form of a hood, others like an almost flat lid, protruding before and behind. Seen more closely, the rises were less pointed, but each seemed riddled with holes like a wasp's nest, until it was clear that these were habitations, or hostels, of stone, caves that had been dug from the rock, and each of them was reached by a single wooden ladder, the various ladders bound to one another from level to level and all together forming, for each of those spurs, an aerial maze that the inhabitants, who from the distance still seemed ants, climbed with agility, up and down. In the center of the city were seen actual houses or buildings, but they were also set into the rock, from which a few feet of facade jutted, and all up high. Farther on, a more important massif was outlined, irregular in form, it, too, a hive of grottos, but of more geometric shape, like so many windows or doors, and in some instances from those fornaces terraces extended, loggias, little balconies. Some of those entrances were covered by a colored curtain, others by mats of woven straw. In other words, the friends were in the center of the cloister of quite wild mountains, and at the same time in the center of a populous and active city, even if surely not as magnificent as they would have expected. They could tell that the city was active and populous from the crowd that animated what were not the streets and squares but, rather, the spaces between peak and spur, between massif and natural tower. It was a multicolored crowd, in which dogs and asses mingled, and many camels, which the travelers had seen at the beginning of their journey, but never so many and so different as in this place, some with one hump, others with two, and still others even with three. They saw also a fire-eater, performing before a cluster of inhabitants while holding a panther on a leash. The animals that most surprised them were some very agile quadrupeds, trained to draw carts. They had the body of a foal, quite long legs with bovine hoofs, they were yellow with great brown spots, and, above all, they had a very long neck surmounted by a camel's head with two little horns at the top. Gabagai said they were leopards, difficult to capture because they fled very swiftly, and only the Sciapods could pursue them and rope them. In effect, though without streets and without squares, that city was all one immense market, and in every free space a tent had been set up, a pavilion erected, a carpet spread out on the ground, a plank laid horizontally on two stones. And they could see displays of fruit, cuts of meat, especially prized, that of the came leopard, carpets woven with all the colors of the rainbow, clothing, knives of black obsidian, stone hatchets, clay cups, necklaces of bones and of little red and yellow gems, hats of the oddest form, shawls, blankets, boxes of inlaid wood, tools for working the land, balls and rag dolls for the children, and amphoras full of liquids, blue, amber, pink, and lemon, and bowls of pepper. The only thing not to be seen in that fair was anything made of metal, and, when asked to explain why, Gavagai didn't understand the meaning of the words iron, metal, bronze, or copper, in whatever language Buandulino tried to name them. In that crowd some very active sciapods were circulating, hopping and skipping with brimming baskets on their heads, and blemier, almost always in isolated groups, or behind counters where coconuts were sold, Pinotians with their ears flapping, except the females, who modestly folded their ears over their breasts, pressing them with one hand, like a shawl, and other people who seemed to have stepped from one of those books of wonders whose miniatures had so excited Buandulino when he was seeking inspiration for his letters to Beatrice. They noticed some men who must have been pygmies, with very dark skin, a loincloth of straw, and, slung over one shoulder, that bow with which, as their nature required, they were at perennial war with cranes, a war that must have granted them no small number of victories, since many of them were offering passers-by their prey, hung on a long stick, which it took 4 of them to carry, 2 at each end. Since the pygmies were shorter than the cranes, the hanging animals swept the ground, and for this reason they had hung them by the neck, so that it was the feet that left a long wake in the dust. Then came the ponces and, even if our friends had read of them, they could not stop studying curiously these creatures with erect legs and no knee joints, walking stiffly, pressing their equine hoofs on the earth. But what made them remarkable was, for the men, their phallus, which hung from the chest, and for the women, in the same position, the vagina, though it could not be seen because they covered it with a shawl knotted behind their back. Tradition demanded that they tend goats with 6 horns, and it was some of these animals that they were selling in the market. Just as was written in the books, Boron kept murmuring in wonderment. Then, in a louder voice, so that Ardzruni could hear him, and in the books it was also written that the vacuum does not exist. Ardzruni shrugged, concerned with discovering if, in some phial, a liquid was being sold that would lighten the skin. To temper the restlessness of all these people, now and then some very black men came by, of tall stature, naked to the waist, with Moorish trousers and white turban, armed only with enormous gnarled clubs that could have felled an ox with a single blow. Since the inhabitants of Pindapedzum were forming clusters as the foreigners passed, especially pointing out the horses, which obviously they had never seen before, the black men intervened to discipline the crowd, and they had only to swing their clubs to create immediately a vacuum around themselves. It had not escaped Buandulino that, when the gathering grew thicker, it was always Gavagai who gave the alarm signal to the black men. From the gestures of many bystanders it was clear that they were eager to act as guide for the illustrious guests, but Gavagai was determined to keep them for himself, and indeed he swaggered, as if to say, "These are my property, hands off." As for the black men, they were, as Gavagai said, the deacon's Nubian guards, whose ancestors had come from the depths of Africa, but they were no longer foreigners because, for countless generations, they had lived in the vicinity of Pindapedzum, and they were sworn to the deacon till death. Finally they saw, much taller than the Nubians, jutting many spans above the heads of the others, the giants, who besides being giants were also one-eyed. They were disheveled, ill-dressed, and, Gavagai said, their occupation was constructing dwellings on those rocks, or else they grazed sheep and oxen, and in this they were excellent, because they could bend a bull to the ground, grasping it by the horns, and if a ram strayed from the flock, they needed no dog, but seized the ram by its fleece and put it back in the place it had left. "And are your people their enemies also?" Buandulino asked. "Here nobody enemy of nobody," Gavagai answered. "You see them all together sell and buy like good Christians. Afterwards all go home, each of them, not stay together to eat or sleep. Each thinks what he wants, even if he thinks wrong. And the giants think wrong. Worse of all, they as Artatyrites, believe Jesus at Last Supper consecrates bread and cheese, because they say that normal food of ancient patriarchs. So they make communion, blaspheming, with bread and cheese and consider heretics all who make it with Burke. But here people who think wrong is almost all, except the sciapods. You told me that in this city there are eunuchs? Do they also think wrong? Better I not speak of eunuchs. Too powerful, they not mix with common people, but think different from me. And, apart from thinking, they're same as you, I imagine. Why, what do I have different from them? Well, you damn Bigfoot, the poet was worked up, do you go with females? With sciapod females, yes, because they do not think wrong. And with your sciapod females you put that thing inside, damn it, but where do you have it? Here, behind leg, like everybody. Apart from the fact that I don't have it behind my leg, and we've just seen come characters who have it above their belly button, at least you know that eunuchs don't have that thing at all and don't go with females? Maybe because eunuchs not like females. Maybe because in Pindapedzum never seen female eunuchs. Poor eunuchs, maybe they like females but don't find eunuch females and can't go with females of Blemier or Pinotians, who think wrong. But you noticed that the giants have only one